Good evening. I now call the October 26, 2021 meeting of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education to order. Is there any opposition? Is there opposition to any items on the agenda? All right. Seeing no opposition, the agenda is adopted by unanimous consent. However, we do need to move an item on the agenda because Mr. Craybill, who we have first on the agenda, actually cannot be on Zoom with us until 7 o'clock. So we need to move item 2A we need to move item 2A to be after the action items. Is that, do I have to state the motion any more clearly than that?
No, you just need to say, is there a motion?
Is there a motion to move 2A to after the action items?
So moved. Second.
Okay, all those in favor, show of hands, please. All right, that is unanimous. And so we will begin tonight with a report from the superintendent on the criteria for consideration regarding our universal masking policy.
Thank you, Madam Chair and board members. Good evening. As board members know, state law currently requires the board to vote on a monthly basis on our face coverings policy. And you all did that at the meeting earlier this month. But during that meeting, there was a request of me to bring forward criteria by which we would recommend modifications to that policy. And I will now turn to Ms. Christine Pajot to make a brief presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent, and good evening, board members. We're actually searching for a clicker here so we can proceed through these slides, unless there's somebody that can advance them for me. All right, so we're going to use some hand signals tonight to forward the slides. So if we could go to the first slide, please. Whomever is assisting. Thank you. So on behalf of the superintendent and the district's COVID-19 response team, what we refer to as DRT, I'm sharing this evening some criteria that the board would consider in either making modifications to or sustaining its mask policy that was enacted. Currently, we have a mask mandate, of course, that applies to indoors for all individuals in our school settings. So first and foremost, we would recommend that the board consider any state, local, or federal mandates regarding masking. So for example, right now we are under a countywide mask mandate that applies to schools. So of course, then this team and the superintendent would be recommending that we stay with our current policy. The second item is that the DRT recommends that this board consider any local, state, or federal guidance with respect to masks. And it just so happens, hot off the press, as of around 3 p.m. this afternoon, the North Carolina DHHS toolkit was updated with respect to masking. So it just is another example to demonstrate how quickly as leaders we have to pivot and adjust based on new guidance. So that guidance is not reflected in the criteria here tonight, but it is really essentially covered under item 2. Thank you. For example, tonight, or the guidance that we just received indicates that if counties are experiencing high or substantial spread, then universal masking should be applied by school districts. However, if counties are experiencing low to moderate spread, then districts can consider making masks optional. So where are we in Mecklenburg County? Just to give a case in point, I know that this is not under deliberation for this evening, but currently our case rate in Mecklenburg County is 117.9 cases per 100,000, which is putting us in high community spread, and our positivity rate is 7.3, which is at moderate community spread. But when we look at community transition rates, the CDC as well as the NCDHS toolkit tell us that if we have two of those indicators and one is higher, then we would go with the indicator that's at the highest level. So in that case, the guidance would be to maintain the universal masking. The toolkit goes on to state that masks could be optional for unvaccinated individuals if all of our metrics are in low community spread. So those are just some examples of the guidance that we would bring before this board that's readily available at the time the board considers modifications. We would also look at the percentage of quarantines this school year in classroom settings where it's difficult or challenging to consistently and appropriately wear masks. So some of our prime examples of those classroom settings would be EC, exceptional children education, and then also pre-K. Oftentimes in those settings, we don't see the children or we're unable to make sure that children are adequately masked the entire time. So it's important to look at our data and what that tells us. If we're seeing a large number of quarantines in those types of classroom settings, or in settings where kids are eating lunch, and that's where we're seeing the quarantines result, then that's an indicator that the masking policy is really important to keep, because you'll recall just prior to the opening of schools this year, NCDHS expanded its quarantine rules so that students who were close contacts with one another or identified as a close contact with someone who tested positive can stay in person and do not have to quarantine if they are properly masked. So that was a big reason that this board took under consideration in instituting the current mask mandate, because it essentially protects in-person learning. Number 4 relates to the number of occurrences of transitions to remote learning. So again, prior to that rule being instated for this school year, last year, if you were a close contact, even if you were masked, you had to quarantine. So we saw a relatively high number of instances where we were transitioning students to remote learning. And we have a slide later on in the presentation that will demonstrate for the board just what a difference we're seeing in those numbers. If the case positivity rate in Mecklenburg County is below 5% for the prior 30 days, the DRT may also recommend modifications to the policy. Now, bear in mind that these numbers may tweak based on the guidance that I just shared, so we have to have time to take that back and review as a team to adjust these values if appropriate. The case rate per 100,000 is another metric that we referenced earlier. This board and the community is familiar with these two metrics because they are currently displayed on our weekly dashboard and have been for quite some time. We've also worked closely with Mecklenburg County Public Health to review, to review what our criteria would be. And one of the areas that they recommended is for us to take a close look at the vaccination rates for children between the ages of 5 and 17. So we expect fully that children as young as 5 will be able to get the vaccination soon. That is data that the county will be able to provide to us. So because that's the majority of our population that we serve, we want to make sure that we understand what those vaccination rates are, and that could help inform this board in terms of whether or not it would like to modify or keep the mask mandate. I don't think I'm controlling that on the screen.
You're not. I think it's coming.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't something. There you go. Finally, if the district is experiencing an increase in the number of clusters district-wide and or the number of schools that experience a cluster increases from the prior month, then that would be another indicator where we would likely recommend that the board consider maintaining the mask policy. A couple of slides here just for demonstration. Last year, this shows the number of transitions to remote that we had, and it was not the entire school year. I mean, it was at some point later on towards the end of the school year that we were able to transition students to remote learning in these circumstances, and that impacted 21 schools and a total of 31 classrooms. This year, we've only had one instance where we've had to transition students to remote learning. So that demonstrates a significant difference, attributable really to the mask policy and the quarantine policies. Also, in terms of EC and pre-K, we know that close to 39% of our quarantines in the month of October, when this was pulled about a week ago, we were close to 40% of quarantines just being in those situations. We also, of course, would have had additional quarantines related to cafeteria situations and others, which are a little bit more difficult to track, but we were able to isolate almost 40%, again, of the quarantines related to EC and pre-K. So that concludes a review of the criteria that the superintendent and the DRT would present to this board on a monthly basis. Of course, we are open to feedback, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, any questions about this report? Ms. Byers-Bailey?
I just have one quick question. I know I have been getting a ton of emails wanting to know what are our criteria, what are our criteria. So it would be helpful if I had this on my laptop that I could just upload, shoot it out on email so I can answer that question. So
We can make that happen, certainly.
thank you.
Ms. Cheek?
So is this criteria information available on our website for parents to see?
Now, some of these metrics are. So for example, the case rate and the positivity rate are currently on the dashboard that's shared weekly and updated weekly. This presentation that I'm referring to is attached currently to board docs so that the public can view and download it there. But we can know, as of right now, this is the first time these are being presented. So in the event that board members had feedback and we wanted to tweak and incorporate additional feedback into those criteria, at that point, we would certainly be in a better position to share on the website.
And like you said, the current rate is over 7% for the county, and the county health department, Ms. Harris has said that she will not consider the mask optional for Mecklenburg County, removing the mask mandate and making masking optional until she has 30 days under 5%.
That's
I
correct.
think she even said 5% and under. I think she said under 5. So in the 4.9 or less. So we're not urgently to the point where this board has to make some considerations, because we're still at least 30 days out, because we know that the county is not there. And at this point, we are under a county mandate for masks in our schools and in pretty much everywhere,
That's right.
except outdoors and football stadiums and such. I'm anxiously awaiting the mask optional day. I'm ready. I'm triple vaccinated. I'm real ready, triply ready. And I'll be advocating for that on this board. When the county lifts their mandate, I would like us to do the same thing. So I'll just make it clear out there, to throw that out into the universe and manifest it to the world. I'll be ready for that at that point. I do think I still am in counties, I work in counties every day where masking is optional. I'm in Iredell a great deal, and a lot of surrounding counties working. I still wear a mask most of the time because it's a comfort when I'm in crowded places. And I do think that a lot of our parents and our students will make that same choice, whether we're optional or not. But I am ready for that day, and I'm hoping that the numbers continue to trend in a really good direction.
Ms. Marshall?
I know that Mecklenburg County publishes information about vaccinations. I'm not sure if I have seen a breakdown on a weekly basis of that age group vaccination rate. Is that something that we have access to? Is that something we should put on the website for that sort of thing?
So I can confirm that it would be something that we have access to because we work closely with the county to include that particular criteria in the deck. I don't know and can't confirm if that's a specific metric that's being shared weekly by the county, but I can certainly find out. And if it's not, then we would work to include that so that our community, our school community can understand what those rates are.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Shipp?
I think it would be good as we can begin to see our younger children have the opportunity to get vaccinations. I think that will also add to this and will be very important. So I think that will make a big difference in our community. And I hope that parents will really look seriously at that for their children coming up very soon.
Yeah, that's an important milestone.
Big
It's a
one.
big milestone. Anybody else? Mr. Strain?
Sure, thank you. So the case rates that determine whether it's minimal, moderate, or high spread, are those aligned between the state case rates that they speak to those three and our case rates? So when they say high, it's the same as when we say high?
I don't know if there's been any recent updates to that end in the most recent iteration of the NCD-HHS, so I can hold and get back with you on that specific question. But I do know what the rates are going from low, moderate to substantial to high in the county. So I believe that they are correlated, but I don't want to tell you that with 100% certainty without having it in front of me.
Of course, the reason I asked the question is if they're calling that out in the toolkit and we're doing what we can to follow the toolkit, then let's make sure we're aligned, that's all.
Yeah, absolutely.
With regards to what we're seeing in other counties that have been mask optional with higher rates of disease prevalence, is there any indication there that that the optional masking in the schools is causing significant serious illness in kids?
So that data is very difficult. It's been challenging to analyze county by county in terms of the relationship to the quarantine rules and protecting in-person learning and the number of quarantines, because it's reported quite differently across the state. So I don't have a lot of specificity to share with you related to that specific point here today, but I can tell you that it is challenging to be able to do that because we want to make sure that we're essentially comparing apples to apples when we do that. We do know that still a significant percentage of the positive cases in our county are among youth. So that's something recently that Dr. Sullivan from the county has shared with us even as recently as today. I want to say it's in the upper 20s or possibly close to 30% of the cases we're seeing in younger children. So that's something we want to be cognizant of. And I think that that brings up the next point about it's important that we consider these criteria, or we would strongly suggest that the board consider this as a multifaceted approach. So there's not necessarily any one indicator on these slides that may drive the decision. Certainly that may be the case if it's substantially different from some of the others. But I think it's important to look at what's happening in the community at the time and all of the things together to make that decision. And if we can get more specific information that's even outside of what this criteria demonstrates, we would certainly want to share that with the board and we would bring it.
I think that's one of the challenges because obviously the wearing of masks is by definition a risk mitigation measure, and the quantification of that risk, we don't really have to guess. We know because there's others that have already taken this step. And so I think that's sort of what's missing in here for me is quantification of the risk that we're considering reducing mitigating measures around. And so I think that's important because people also have to recognize there are benefits associated with removal of masks as well as benefits of wearing masks, right? And so those are the things that I think we need to consider. The board received an email this morning about some of the challenges associated with early childhood development and phonics and being able to see one another's faces when you're trying to do early literacy, to teach early literacy. It's one of the many challenges associated with it. One final question there is around the vaccine rate. You mentioned in point 7 here, 50% or more of children aged 5 to 17 are vaccinated. I think that's a pipe dream. We'll see what the take up is like, but again, the vaccination is a risk mitigation measure, and it's going to be down to every parent to decide whether that is a step that they want and need to take with their children. I mean, as I think I've been very clear, 3 of mine are eligible and all 3 are vaccinated. But that being said, that was a personal choice. And I think given the vaccination rate in our much higher risk communities that have just tipped over 50%, to have this be 50%, I don't know that we'd ever get there. And so I was surprised to see it on here, particularly at that level.
Well, I think it's important to understand that it is a balance. So going back to it being a multifaceted approach, so that particular metric may be something where we have far to reach. However, we have other metrics on here like case positivity rate that have been steadily declining over the past several weeks. So it's not without question, and we'll likely get there to that threshold where the DRT would be more comfortable making a recommendation as such. But at the end of the day, it certainly is the board's call to look at all of these criteria or some of them or weigh certain certain of the criteria heavier than others, based on your thoughts and your perspectives and what you also know about the community.
Well, I'll join my colleague, Ms. Cheek, in saying that when the Department of Health here in the county decides that we're in a position as a community that they're going to rescind their mask mandate, I'll certainly be looking at doing the same within our schools, because we haven't seen in surrounding counties who have had mask optional in schools the entire time, we don't see significant rates of serious illness in children as a result. And so that's, for me, that's the risk that we're looking to mitigate. And we know what risk we would bear by removing the mandate, because at much higher levels of transmission in those adjacent counties through the surge, we didn't have significant incidents of youth serious illness due to this disease. So thank you very much.
So, thank you for sharing this thought process, which I think, you had some board members who asked, that's the context for where this came from. We don't have a vote on masks tonight. We are required to vote monthly, but not at this meeting. But just to understand what is the thought process? What are the factors? And I know your team has worked with the county health department to pull these factors together. And I understand that it's not that anyone forces the decision, and it's also not that you have to check off everything in the box, but it's just that in this complex, fast-moving phenomenon of COVID, of education during COVID, these are all the characteristics to balance that will inform ultimately your recommendation for that glorious day when we can go to mask optional. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
All right. So now we're going to move on to a first reading. I'm going to turn to Board Member Lenora Shipp, who's the chair of the Policy Committee, for the first reading of Exhibit IKF-E, which is on graduation requirements.
Thank you. Members of the board, the item before us tonight is the first reading of proposed changes to Exhibit IKF-E, graduation requirements. If approved, the modifications to the exhibit would suspend the CPR requirement for graduation as outlined in North Carolina Session Law 2021-130. The changes to the exhibits were discussed by the Policy Committee at the October 19th meeting, and we approved by a 4-0 vote. Since this modification is to comply with a state law, the change is being considered via the fast-track process. Therefore, we will have a public hearing and a vote of the board at tonight's meeting. With that, Madam Chair, I conclude the first reading of Exhibit IKF-E, graduation requirements.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So now we'll move on to the public engagement portion of the meeting. We have 6 public hearings, and the rules for each hearing are as follows. Each speaker will be called to speak one at a time. Each speaker will have a maximum of 3 minutes to address the board. Each speaker may only talk about the topic that is the subject of the public hearing. Individual student matters or specific personnel matters may not be discussed. Personal attacks will not be allowed. Profanity or other inappropriate language will not be allowed. And the board reserves the right to, it says mute any speaker who violates these rules, but hold any speaker who violates these rules because we're in person today. So our first hearing is on policy exhibit IKF-E, graduation requirements. Madam Clerk, do we have any speakers?
Madam Chair, there are none.
Okay, then I will declare the public hearing for exhibit IKF-E closed. Next, we have a public hearing for the school board policy process, policy BG. Do we have any speakers?
Madam Chair, there are none.
All right, I declare that public hearing closed. Next, we've got public hearing for Exhibit BGE, the Board of Education Policy Process. Any speakers for this hearing?
Madam Chair, there are none.
All right. BGE, Exhibit BGE hearing is closed. Moving right along, we've got a hearing for the proposed board electoral redistricting maps. Do we have any speakers for this hearing?
Madam Chair, there are none.
Okay. For the redistricting maps?
I don't think.
Might be student assignment.
Yeah, I thought you were signed up for, no, we're talking about electoral redistricting maps. Yeah.
It's confusing.
Now, we are coming to the proposed, the hearing.
Did you declare that being closed? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Declared it closed.
Oh, sorry. I declare the public hearing for the proposed board electoral redistricting maps closed. Next, I know we do have speakers for the proposed school boundary for Olympic Relief High School. We do have 2 speakers signed up for this public hearing. And so if you would both come down, we've got 2 podiums. Carla Brazel, I hope I've pronounced your name right, and please correct me if I haven't. Okay. And Bob Fredrickson.
Hi, good evening. I'm sorry. I always get a little nervous in situations like that because I'm not originally from here. I'm originally from Brazil. And I'm a resident of Steel Creek for almost 20 years now. And before I start, I want to personally thank Ms. Lenore Ship and Ms. Thelma Byers-Bailey to have given the time to the community and all the CMS board for listening to us. And I would just like to speak to you because of the email that I sent yesterday to you all, going over the numbers, going back and forth, again, listening to the board members on their opinions about how we should share and how to divide the 2 new schools, like divide the schools to become the Olympic Relief, which again, this was made to be Olympic Relief. I was crunching the numbers this weekend, and I proposed a different third option that I believe you all received. We want to try to be fair to both sides, so we encourage for you to go review, and if you have any questions, you all have my email, and I truly appreciate just you guys giving a thought. So I would say thank you very much, and we all very excited for this new high school, but we wanted to be fair to the residents of the Steel Creek. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Mr. Fredrickson?
Hello, board members. Our family has lived in Steel Creek for over a decade. Our children have attended CMS schools since kindergarten and are currently in the middle school. We choose to live here in large part because of the diversity. As parents of 2 Hispanic children, this is one of our core values. I'm here to share my thoughts on the Olympic Relief High School, a school that our community enthusiastically supported, and now we ask you to be transparent and to listen to us. Although there hasn't been a sharing of the survey results, we have been told the public overwhelmingly voted for the green scenario, and the primary reason was the distance to school. Is anyone really surprised that distance to school would be such a motivating factor? As a working family with 2 teenagers who are seemingly always on the go, we take any opportunity to save time. Most days we feel like personal Uber drivers for our kids, and I imagine other families feel the same. There was no way to achieve diverse SES at both schools in the green scenario. We all know that diverse SES in schools is important to CMS, and I agree. So why was the green scenario even an option? The CMS presentation stated a positive to the Violet plan is that it decreases home-to-school distance for current Harding students, shifting to the Olympic Relief High. This is not true. Using Nations Ford Elementary School as the starting point, the distance to Harding is 7.7 miles and approximately 17 minutes driving. The distance to the Olympic Relief School is 12 miles and approximately 26 minutes driving. This does not factor into the horrendous traffic jams that we experience in Steel Creek every single day. I also question the accuracy of the data being used. We know the data being used is from 2016, and that updated data will be available in December. Why is CMS making such an important and impactful decision with outdated information? As an example, since 2016, there have been 4,547 new housing units approved for construction in Steel Creek alone. A resident, Carla, did a bunch of research on her own, and based on the information she obtained from calling local schools and various sources, getting current SCS data, the Violet scenario will create a very imbalanced SCS diversity in both schools, with the Olympic Relief having potentially over 600 low SCS children, and Olympic High with just over 100. Violet is also not the best option. I know there is no perfect option. I ask you to go back to the drawing board, create a plan that listens to the public needs, uses more current data, and creates more equitable SCS diversity, not just next year, but for many years to come. A county commissioner once said to me, the best thing for government is to be 100% transparent. I would add that listening to your community and being transparent is a sign of good leadership. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Okay, so those were our two speakers for the Olympic Relief High School boundary, and I declare this public hearing closed. Next, we have, and actually last but not least, we have the public hearing for the proposed school boundary for Bain, Lebanon Road, and Piney Grove Elementary's relief. We do have 3 speakers for this public hearing, and if you could all come down to the 2 mics, divvy them up as you wish. We've got Rhonda Walker, then Catherine Good, and then Paul Connors. And Ms. Walker is up first.
Okay, I apologize for my misunderstanding earlier. I'm Rhonda Walker, here to speak about the Visage community. I wanted to speak to you about the new Southeast Elementary School relief map, the rezone map. Over the summer, we Visage found out about the rezone and that there were 2 proposed neighborhoods included in the rezone map to attend Bain Elementary School, and we were not in Visage. Back in 2003, we were told by CMS that everyone on the right side of True Light Church Road must attend Lebanon Road Elementary, and everyone on the left side must attend Bain Elementary School. Fast forward to today, 2021, the new homes on our right and left side of True Light Church Road are all going to Bain except us. So we're just wondering what happened. The 2 neighborhoods on our side of the road will attend Bain, which has 64% utilization, and Visage was left out again to attend Lebanon, which has 122% utilization. Although, after several school board meetings, emails, and hard work from Akeisha Craven Howell, we were thrilled to see that an addendum has been added to both maps with 2 scenarios, allowing Visage and also Cool Springs to attend Bain Elementary School like our neighbors. That will give Bain 83% utilization, and all of our kids can continue to play together. Parents can look out for each other's kids at the bus stop, and we can be a complete community again. Bain Elementary School is also closer to us than the Southeast Elementary School. So with sidewalks, our kids are close enough to bike or even walk to school. We're also, with Lebanon being overcrowded, it just makes sense to have Visage and Cool Springs to attend Bain. It will take the stress off of teachers, help reduce cafeteria worker stress, and will also help custodial staff keep the school COVID-free. We hope to have the Superintendent Winston's recommendation, and we hope to have the school board make the most sensible, equitable, and logical vote, and vote to have our children all attend the same school. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Catherine Good, or Good.
Good. Hi, my name is Katie Good. I have 3 children that currently attend Bain and 1 future Bobcat as well. Yesterday at 5:30 p.m., my neighbors and I were made aware of changes to the boundary of the new Southeast Relief School that included our neighborhood and several others currently zoned to Bain Elementary. We learned that the rationale behind the late expansion of the relief boundary into Bain was a recently completed study on the safety and long-term use of the Early Learning Academy, or ELA, building that houses our kindergarten students. We applaud the study and are grateful to the committee for considering the safety and soundness of the building that houses our most precious assets. It certainly provides important information to consider. However, the foregone conclusion was the ELA building should be removed from service and 53 students should be rerouted from Bain to the relief school. No alternatives were presented for the future of the ELA building. Under this guise, it seems as though we expect it to simply disappear. When the building is retired, what will become of it? An unsafe building, whether now or in the future, cannot simply be left on the campus. What the current plan fails to consider is whether there is a better alternative, including potential capital expenditures to repair the building. I recognize this begins to seem like a separate topic from the relief school boundaries, and that is my point. A decision on the ELA building will lead to new funding needs regardless of its determined use. It should be treated as a separate matter and not the basis for a change in boundaries. The ELA building is a valued part of Bain. It's home to our smallest Bobcats. The kinder and first grade students enjoy a small community and a simpler place to transition into elementary school. When they graduate to the big building, they feel excitement and a readiness to grow into the responsibilities of first and second grade. For parents, it's a relief to send your child and first-time student into their own little piece of Bain. The ELA building is part of the Bain community, and its future should be discussed with the Bain community and not determined as part of a relief school strategy. The results of the ELA safety study are valuable and should be explored, though I'll note we have not seen them. A robust set of alternatives and cost-benefit analysis should be the basis for determining if and when a school should be retired, not just a study completed the week before a school board vote on a relief school. Moving 53 students next year won't resolve this issue and is an unnecessary consequence of a rushed decision. Lastly, I'll speak to due process. Clearly, there has not been any with respect to a new plan for Bain relief. Everything up to this point has stated there's no relief needed for Bain. So our ask is simple: spend more time. The relief school still isn't built. The ELA building is still safe for use. Let's do the work to get to the best answer for our school and for our community. We believe that both Bain and the relief school will benefit from further consideration. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And finally, Paul Connors.
Hello. Thank you for letting me address the board tonight. My name is Paul Connors. I'm the father of 2 proud Bain Bobcats with another one a few years out. I attended the Southeast Elementary Relief CMS Board of Education virtual meeting last night. I was shocked to see a completely new plan different from anything shared and discussed at the previous sessions on this topic or anything that can be found publicly online. As recently as the October 12th meeting, 2 weeks ago, it was publicly presented by Ms. Craven-Howell, the Associate Superintendent for School Options and Design, that Bain Elementary would not be considered for relief. Even at this very moment, if I visit the Planning Services website for the new Southeast Elementary Relief and click on the maps for the pink, red, and yellow scenarios, my neighborhood is not designated for reassignment to the new school. And if I dig even deeper and look into the publicly posted files on the Planning Services SharePoint, I can see scenarios for fuchsia and blue that were posted on October 19th, 7 days ago, again, neither of which include my neighborhood for reassignment. Yet last night, Ms. Craven-Howell presented a new map that I cannot find anywhere publicly available that does list my neighborhood for reassignment. I was told the board is having a vote tonight on a plan that has not been made public and that has not had any chance for community engagement or due process. That is a terrifying prospect and a dangerous precedent. The process for this new relief school was clearly defined during the first engagement session on March 22nd and is also included in the detailed presentation for the September and October engagement sessions, but the board has not adhered to this process they laid out in the plan they have followed for a year. The only valid options the board should consider are those that have been publicly posted, discussed, and subject to comment. Bain relief has never been on the table as part of the proposals posted or discussed. I'd like to read a quote from Ms. Craven-Howell from the October 12th meeting in reference to a planning relief capacity table. And I quote, "Bain in 2019-20 was at 83% capacity. That is because there are a number of classrooms in an older part of the facility that were not included in their utilization calculation when it was included in the bond in 2017. Since that time, we have made some investment in improving the condition of those classrooms in that facility, and it is being included in Bain's utilization calculation. So for that reason, we are no longer looking at relieving Bain. That was 2 weeks ago. I have to question how the committee could confirm that no relief is needed for Bain in every meeting throughout this process, including as recently as October 12th, and then somehow commission a complete study, reverse course, and change boundaries in just 2 weeks, again, with no public notice or engagement, when they've had an entire year to perform this process. The only vote should be on options that have followed the process laid out by the board. Could the board please explain to me how the lives of my family and many other families are going to be totally disrupted by a decision we were not allowed to discuss in or engage? Thank you again very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Connors. So I now declare the public hearing for the proposed school boundary for Relief School for Bain, Lebanon Road, and Piney Grove closed. Next, we've got our consent agenda. Is there a motion that the board approve the consent agenda items?
So moved. Second.
Okay. Before we move to a vote, does any board member wish to pull any part of this item for individual consideration? Hearing none. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. Any opposed? So, Madam Clerk, that is unanimous. Now, we are going to move to our action items. Oh, I always forget to turn to you to introduce the principal. Turn to the superintendent to introduce a new personnel appointment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to introduce this evening Dr. Sharon Powell as the new principal of Oakdale Elementary School. Dr. Powell is currently the assistant principal at Thomasboro Academy, and prior to that, she served as a dean of students as well as a Title I instructional coach at Druid Hills Academy. We're excited for Dr. Powell to assume her new role, and I congratulate her on this appointment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Now we shall move on to the action items. I'm moving too fast tonight. First, we're going to, the first action item is recommendation for approval of modifications to policy BG. And I'm going to turn to Lenora Shipp, Chair of the Policy Committee, to make the motion for its adoption. And this does not require a second because it's an item reported out of committee. All yours.
Madam Chair, I move to approve the proposed changes to policy BG, school board policy process. These changes will clarify the different aspects of the policy book and define the process to create, modify, or retire an item. These changes were discussed by the policy committee at the September 21st, 2021 committee meeting and were approved by the committee on a 2-1 vote.
All right. Any discussion before I call the vote?
Need a second. Oh, I'm sorry. No, you don't.
Good. Okay. All right. All those in favor of the motion, please let it be known by a show of hands. Any opposed? And that passes unanimously. Next, I'm going to turn this back over to Board Member Lenora Shipp again, Chair of the Policy Committee, to recommend approval of modifications to Exhibit BGE. And again, this does not require a second because it's an item reported out of committee. Back to you, Ms. Shipp.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I move to approve the proposed changes to Exhibit BGE, Board of Education Policy Process. These changes will create an illustrative flow chart outlining the board's policy process. These changes were discussed by the Policy Committee at the September 21st, 2021 committee meeting and were approved by the committee on a 2-1 vote. Thank you.
Okay. Any discussion of this? Okay, all those in favor of the motion, please let it be known by a show of hands. And that is unanimous. Thirdly, we have recommending approval of modifications to Exhibit IKF-E graduation requirements. And I'm going to turn again to Lenora Schiff, Chair of the Policy Committee, to make this motion, and we will not need a second.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I move to approve the proposed changes to Exhibit IKF-E, graduation requirements. If approved, the modifications to the exhibit would suspend the CPR requirements for graduation as outlined in North Carolina Session Law 2021-130. The changes to the exhibit were discussed by the Policy Committee at the October 19th meeting and were approved by a 4-0 vote. Additionally, the committee voted to fast-track the changes to the exhibit as its proposed is compliant with state law. Thank you.
Any discussion on this? Okay, all those in favor of the motion, show of hands, please. And that is another unanimous vote. And before I move to the next action item, for which I'm going to turn to you, Superintendent Winston, on the calendar, academic calendar, first I just want to share with the public that we have decided, Superintendent and I both decided to remove the action item on this 2 student assignment votes from the agenda tonight and put that off until the November 9th meeting to give some more time for some consideration for those options. So just wanted to let you know about that if you're wondering what happened to that. Okay, so our final action item is consideration of a recommended change to the 2021-2022 CMS academic calendar. And before the board acts, I'm going to turn to the superintendent to introduce this item and to make a recommendation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be brief before turning things over to Dr. Matt Hayes and Ms. Beth Thompson. This matter is before the board as a recommendation because, and Dr. Hayes will share this momentarily, this is an opportunity to address a growing concern in the district. We want to provide our educators, our valued educators, some additional planning time and an opportunity to be able to take advantage of state-mandated professional development. And so we're bringing a recommendation to add an additional teacher workday next week, as well as 3 additional early release days, the latter of which does not require board approval, but the additional teacher workday on November 1st does require board approval. Dr. Hayes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Superintendent Winston, Madam Chair, and Board. We bring to you this evening a recommendation to the change for the 21-22 calendar. As Superintendent Winston just mentioned and elaborated on just a little bit further, this is to address the time loss that we've experienced due to COVID, significantly impacting our teachers and staff's ability to plan and implement properly to meet the needs of our students and also be able to evaluate the outcomes to this point. This is also specifically designed to address and enable our elementary school teachers to address the referenced areas as Superintendent Winston stated and myself, but also to complete the hefty load of a state-mandated professional development that is a part of the LETTERS program implementation that is state-mandated. So the recommendation that we bring to the board this evening is to recommend approval of 1 additional teacher workday on November the 1st. Just to give some context of where this falls, it falls right before an already established teacher workday on November the 2nd. It would decrease the instructional days to 176, but we would still be able to meet the hours requirements that outlined by the state. And November the 1st would remain a work day for 9-month staff who will perform regular and modified duties
that may include training and professional development as well. So they will report to school and to work that day. Once again, that's what's being brought forward to the board as our proposal for November the 1st as a teacher workday. Also, additionally, operation changes, which superintendent will be adding 3 early release days to the calendars to support the teacher professional development and planning needs. These are additional early release days that do not require board approval at this time. Those would be on November the 17th, February the 9th, and March 30th. So we will pause here at this time to take any questions from the board.
Questions? No questions? Ms. Marshall?
I think I've gotten a number of emails, with conversation on having to scurry to find some childcare. I think, and really, I think almost all of the emails that have been in protest of this have come from elementary school parents. And I do want to speak a little bit. I'm going to comment. I'll probably ask you a couple questions in here. Just to let the public know, in May, the General Assembly put something in, and Mr. Jeter could probably shout out the number of the statute that they modified to mandate a specific training to be completed in a pretty short period of time. And this was a surprise to many of us who watch this type of thing to see that jump in. This is a training that I think will be very beneficial to our students. I think it's something we will all welcome. But sometimes things come at probably the toughest time they could come. This would be one. This is a science of reading training, and I'm seeing a nod from the subject expert here who knows what benefit this is going to give to our students. But it was, when I read the statute and the language there, it was, this training sounded great, but the devil's in the details. And so when that rolled out, which I believe was probably late summer, it's an 80-plus hour training for our staff, and that might even be on the low side of it. So to speak to how long that training, how long we have, and we're trying to pull that out, and then to sort of talk about the fact that we've had low substitutes being able to pick up quarantine times for teachers. And this first part of the year has been a surprise in terms of difficulty for us and for every district that I have heard of across this country. But we're trying to do this training right now too. So I think, can you speak to what letters, just briefly, what you see the benefit of and what families can anticipate from giving up this day, frankly, and there is benefit there, even though it feels hard right now, and what we expect that day to look like and the next day for our teaching staff.
Sure. Letters it is state mandated, and it is exceptional professional development that teaches teachers how to teach students to read. I mean, it's as basic as that. What we're able to do is actually take our beginning of year data and start to look at where students are in need of additional learning, specifically around that science of reading or how children start to learn to read. And the components, the units within letters will teach teachers exactly how to address the needs that students have. It is a 2-year professional development that goes very deeply into the theory behind why this is important, but then also the technical aspects of how to use our curriculum to be able to then support students in being able to read. This particular year, the rollout happened at the state level a little later than they anticipated. So our highest hope was that we would actually have been doing this professional development back in August on our teacher work days. The contract was not approved for letters at the state at that time, so we have been delayed in rolling it out. We've been going as fast as we can, but that has been due to contracting requirements at the state level. For this particular school year, we have said, hey, where are our options to make this really doable and meaningful for teachers? What the state has said is that they can't remove the legislative requirement, right? It's in legislation, but what they can do is work with us along timeline. And so because of that delayed start, there is an additional time. In other words, we do not have to finish by the end of June. We have until next August to be able to, for our teachers to be able to complete this. By next August, our pre-K 5 teachers need to have completed units 1 through 4. A portion of each unit is synchronous virtually. And so that's time bound. That would be a 6-hour portion of the course. And then the other portion of each unit is asynchronous, and so what we would call mastery-based. So we don't know exactly how long that's going to take for each individual teacher, but as teachers progress through it, or in many cases, groups of teachers are doing it as a professional learning community on a work day or during a planning time, as they finish and move through the course, then they're able to do so at their own pace. In order to support planning, Letters has told us that they gauge about 20 hours per unit. So to your point, 20 times 4 would put us at 80 hours by the completion of Letters. I hope that helps.
That does. Thank you. I think it's hard when we're making changes, and I understand that. I think the benefit will be for the instruction of our students, and our teachers need a little bit of a breather, and we're not giving them a lot of breathers. But I think this is well warranted. I also want to tell the public, I do anticipate that the calendar committee will keep Election Day as a work day going forward. And I've messaged that to everyone that's reached out to me. And I think this is a very appropriate thing. So look for that going forward. And I don't anticipate this happening again. And we want to work with our state partners to let them know that these big changes that are made last minute have downstream impacts. And this isn't a perfect example of that, but thank you for what you're doing. And again, thank you to our teachers who are having to implement all this, because I know it is just so difficult at a really incredibly tough time. So thank you.
Dr. Jones and then Ms. Cheek.
Thank you. While I recognize state mandates, I have two important questions. How is this training a value added from what we've been doing? And because I haven't been able to discern that, what is the golden nugget that drives this?
I think that it is content that is similar to what we have been doing, but the depth at which facilitators are able to take teachers exceeds an amount of time and depth of content that we have ever had. We haven't spent 80 hours on professional development around the science of reading. It is premier professional development. The facilitators are extraordinarily skilled. They know their craft really well, and they have put together this professional development such that teachers are able to work through it. They are able to show their competency, like that they have mastered the learning, and then move forward. It also sequences directly through. So Unit 1, for example, is starting with how the brain is wired, and literally the science of how people think and acquire learning around how to read, and then moves into Unit 2, which will start with phonemic awareness, which is the most important thing that our pre-K children can learn to be able to enter kindergarten ready to be on grade level. So it is extraordinarily comprehensive and done at a really high level by skilled facilitators.
I hear what you're saying. Over the years, 50 years, I'm telling my age, all of this rolls around. So how do you see this? I still don't get the answer on how this is different from the programs across decades that is a new science or the golden nugget that I ask.
Yeah, it's been around, so it's not a new thing necessarily, but it is the most comprehensive. It is the most in-depth professional development that I know of that teaches teachers the science of reading or reading foundational skills.
So in elementary education programs, college prep, do they get that?
That's actually a part of the Senate Bill 367 Excellence in Education Act, is that our teacher preparation programs now are required to include science of reading learning in their preparation of teachers. The reality is, though, is that we have teachers who are entering the profession from various pathways now. So we do need to make sure that all of our teachers who are working with our pre-K through 5th grade students know beyond a shadow of a doubt how to teach our children to read. That's critical, and this does that.
And if I could just remind us all that this calendar change is to allow for the extra professional development that is required by the state. So letters, we're not voting on the training. We're just voting on whether to change the calendar to give teachers a little bit more time to do the training that they have to do. Ms. Cheek?
So letters is for pre-K through 5, correct?
That's correct.
What does it stand for? It's an acronym, and I just am always like kind of funny about what does that actually do? Does anyone know?
You're going to put me on the spot. Can I get
That's
back
okay.
to you on
Just
that, sir?
email me, because I'm like,
I will do that, yes.
I've named organizations with acronyms, and I'm always just curious as to what they're actually pulled together to make it. But it's LETRS, just so the community that's listening knows what we're talking about. It's not the letters of the alphabet. It's LETRS, all capitals. So it's for pre-K through 5. I kind of recall most of our time this year, at least a lot of it, was occupied by some back and forth with our county commission colleagues. And we've had some folks from the NAACP come and speak to us a few times, and a lot of other parents. And the big thing everybody keeps talking to us about is our kids can't read, and we've got to do something. So I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe this is evidence that we are trying to do something, and the state is trying to do something. Across the state of North Carolina is not known as the bastion of excellent reading, and maybe this is one of those ways to turn the corner. Starting with pre-K, we can make a big difference. 4 grades, 4 levels of learning that children can get to before that 3rd grade, which is the really crucial time that children really need to demonstrate reading readiness. So I'm real excited about the training.
I am too.
I would love to hear from Dr. Hayes what our middle and high school teachers will be doing during these additional days that are being requested, since this training is just for pre-K through 5.
Yes, ma'am, and this goes back to Ms. Marshall, you had commented on this as well, is that in our middle and high schools, what we do know is because of COVID, because of the tracing that was taking place and teachers having to be out, that we had many teachers that were covering extensively amounts of time during their planning. That planning is critical to their success, to the student success, because that's where they sit down, they're disaggregating the data that they're pulling from students. They're looking at their lessons, they're talking about lesson designs, and all those critical pieces of the work. So that's been robbed from them up until this point. So this allows them the opportunity to really work on their planning, meet in the PLCs, meet with their administration, and really focus in on preparing for the next quarter of instruction as we begin to launch into second quarter.
So it means language essentials with a little f for teachers, reading and spelling.
Of reading and spelling.
That's it. So everybody just texted me that. My watch is blowing up. And Jennifer showed it to me too. So I was like, I just wanted to make sure that when we're talking about the letters, I didn't want people to think we're talking about letters in the alphabet or something. So
Good catch.
So that is very good to hear. I'm hearing from a lot of high school teachers in the math, especially, that there's a lot of professional development that they need. Is that going to be done? We're going to start some of that on Monday?
Yes, it actually had been scheduled for November 1st. We were in a little bit of a panic because of lack of substitutes. We've been having to reschedule, go to people's PLCs, hold sessions in the evenings and afternoons. And so now we can have it synchronously with teachers on November 1st as originally planned.
So that is great to hear. So I'm very soft on this. I hear I'm a parent until recent, till my son's in college now, but I was a single parent. While my son went from kindergarten through 5th grade, I was a single mom, and I was a nurse, and my schedules were put out 3 months in advance. And so to hit me with a teacher work day, suddenly I was so blessed, because I had a village of friends that would just say, hey, come in our house for the day. It's no big deal. Not everybody has that luxury. So my heart is a little bit torn for all the parents that are lacking a place for their child to be that's a safe place if they have to be at work. So like Ms. Marshall, that's the main complaint I've had. Then I have a whole nother group of kindergarten of elementary age parents that are so happy that their kids don't have to get up and get on a bus the morning after trick-or-treating, which does happen to be the night before November 1st. So I had several of them throw that one at me too, that we should have always done that. So I'm struggling a little bit with the addition even, and it's also a big challenge for parents to have those two additional half days in the spring?
There's 3 additional half-days.
3 additional half-days in the spring.
Yes, ma'am, and we were looking at 4, but due to needing to meet the requirements of the state, we reduced that from 4 to 3.
So we have that. And are we going to bring teachers in this summer to try to get the rest of this caught up before the end of August when we need to?
You must have read my mind, because that was the meeting I was in this afternoon, is starting to look at summer plans. What we currently are mapping out would be if teachers do not want to work over the summer or complete professional development over the summer, which is real and 100% understandable, a fast track so that people could be finished by June, but they know it's going to be a faster track. And then a slower track, I feel like maybe we need a better name than that. But for people who do want to take their time and have the summer to be able to finish it, then they could take through, and we'll have sessions that go both ways so that folks can choose which one is going to work best for them.
So if I'm correct in what you said, this was in some legislation that was in May, I believe, Ms. Marshall? So we kind of knew it existed, but we weren't really given a lot of details. And so when we started getting the details, you were like, let's start it. It's August. We could do this before school starts. But guess what? The state hadn't finalized the contracts with the vendor yet. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So where the state have been efficient with that, we could have done this prior to the school year. We may not have been in the same situation. So are other counties around us also facing these same challenges? Have you talked to your colleagues in our surrounding areas?
Every other day, and yes, they all are. And there are some districts that will be starting with cohort 2, and then other districts that are assigned to cohort 3. And so those districts are watching us to see how we work through these issues. But yes, it has been something we've been working through together to try to figure out how to best implement. I think the thing that is tricky for Charlotte specifically is that we are the largest district that is currently implementing. Okay. So when we're scheduling synchronous sessions, we're scheduling for 5,000 teachers, all through Eventbrite, all through our staff. And so when we're not facilitating the professional development, which Dr. Jones is what makes it different, right? And really good is that the vendor's providing the professional development, but they can provide up to 800 available slots at any given time. So if you take the difference between 5,000 and 800, that means we have to schedule a lot of sessions on a lot of days in lots of various times. And to be fair, we've had feedback from folks. There are people that prefer weekend professional development with a stipend, but they prefer that. Or but then there are some that really do not, and for family reasons can't. And we completely understand that as well. So we're trying to provide maximum flexibility, both for teachers and for schools to schedule as best they can.
So the reason I bring those up was more anecdotal. I kind of knew the answers, but I just wanted to say it for the public, because one of the other things I saw a lot on social media, because I do monitor and see what people are saying, was, oh my gosh, CMS can't ever get their act together. Why would they not know all this was happening? Well, we did know it was happening. We just couldn't do anything about it until the vendors were released, and that was really just a few weeks ago.
Right, and then we have limited teacher work days with which to do it, right? And that aren't religious holidays or days we want to take.
Our calendar was voted on a year and a half ago.
That's correct.
So I wish that we didn't have to do it with such short notice. Would prefer maybe around like Veterans Day, but then I look at what's coming. We can't really tie it to Thanksgiving because then nobody would show up for school that whole week, and I don't think people would even want to do PD that week. So I'm aching for those parents that are struggling with this, but I do want the public to know that this was not something that was done in haste. This was not something that we waited until the last minute to work on. It was something that we were kind of delivered at the last minute. So I appreciate you explaining that, and I appreciate you making sure, Dr. Hayes, that all the other people other than the pre-K through 5 are doing really excellent professional development training deep cleaning of facilities, making sure the buses are all ready to roll and that everything else is ready for our kids so that on November 3rd, they have the best day back to school. Thank you.
Ms. Shipp?
Yes, I have one or two questions. One, I know this is really good. You know, I was a professional development person for a while. So I know this language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling is going to be good. Talk to me a little bit about the spelling piece versus vocabulary, because I saw that asked too. Why spelling now in this as opposed to we've done a lot with vocabulary? How is that being looked at?
Right, well, it will include both. So over the course of 2 years, it's going to work on the decoding portion, and it's going to start with the brain. That's what folks are doing right now, but then it will work on the decoding portion, and then it will also work on comprehension skills and vocabulary building.
That was just a question I've heard brought up actually by teachers and staff. The other thing is, as we put this in for professional development, I want to make sure that throughout the district, we will ensure that that's what happens with those days. Because many times we assign these days and schools say different things are going on in their building. So.
Thank you, Ms. Shipp. So I want to be very clear in what this day is to be used for. It is a mandatory teacher workday. It will be used for letter training. It'll be used for PD. That is it. And it is not in the PD for the letter trainings and then also for planning. We have made it very clear to central office and everyone else, there's to be no other PD that distracts our teachers from having this opportunity, because this is what it was designed for. And that includes the workday and the other 3 early release days that we're bringing forward for vote tonight.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
And then my last question, I heard this one. Usually this time of the year, we have parent-teacher conferences, and we come to the end of the quarter and we give teachers time to do their grades and all that. How is that being figured in at this time?
So that is what they were doing. Many schools already had that planned for Tuesday to do that either in person or virtually with their families and their schools. So that'll be taking place as well. The rest of the calendar has not been touched. I'm going to be very clear with that. Nothing else on the calendar that was already on the calendar prior to this. One day has changed, and so it will continue as it has been.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Strain?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one of the things I'd like to understand is, so the legislation was passed in April, right? The contracts were signed at some point over the last, 2 months. And we started working with the vendor to get this time scheduled. I assume, since you've brought this forward, that we've got all our slots scheduled for Monday to do as part of the first cohort. So part of the question is these cohorts. You mentioned cohorts 1, 2, possibly 3. What does that mean?
That means that all districts in the state aren't starting letters at the same time. So CMS is a part of, basically they've taken the districts in the state and they've divided them into 3 separate cohorts, and those cohorts start at various times. Cohort 2, I believe, is slated to start in January. CMS is a part of cohort 1. We were slated to start in August, but due to delays in the contract, I believe it was signed in mid-September. We were not able to start until we launched in October.
So all of cohorts 1 is in a time crunch.
That's correct.
So when does cohort 1, this synchronous training, have to be completed?
There's a portion of each unit that is synchronous. So 6 hours of each 20 hours approximately unit is synchronous. And it has to take place sometime within the unit 1. For us, that right now is our unit 1 sessions, synchronous sessions are scheduled across November and December.
Okay, so unit 1 would be across November and December, and then 2, 3, and 4 would follow up through August.
Mm-hmm. And that's where we talked about kind of having a fast track if folks want to finish by June, and then a track that moves a little more slowly. Yes.
Right. So what's plan B? What's plan if? So the challenge that I have is taking kids out of classrooms. Mm-hmm. Right? We've talked a lot, and probably not even enough. I know not enough about the challenges we have in recovering kids who have fallen further and further behind. And so if we were going to minimize disruption to teaching and learning, how do you do that? What's plan B if we're not going to cancel another day of school? and to introduce 3 more half-days, which those are negatively impacting teaching and learning as well. And so what's plan B if we don't do that and have those impacts to our kids and our families?
Teachers are completing professional development on their own time.
And I would add to that, Mr. Strain, that anything we can do to provide supports for our teachers and at the same time improve morale of our teaching force, kids are better served for that, I believe, at the end of the day when we can do those things. And so that's why I've made the recommendation to the board and would strongly encourage the board to approve this recommendation.
So I've said a lot, every day matters for kids in the classrooms. I think we proved that in spades when we looked at our results, particularly relative to some of the other county results. And I'm concerned that we're reducing classroom time for kids. And so I understand the challenges, absolutely acknowledge the value of the and need for this professional development in the program. But I would have liked to have seen another plan besides pulling kids out of classrooms to do it. And I know the other counties are coming up with different plans as well. And some are, introducing additional teacher work days, et cetera. Particularly the short notice here, I don't understand in terms of, why we're introducing this with such short notice. And so that in and of itself is disruptive as well. And so I'll struggle to support this. Thank you.
Ms. Fowler?
Yes, thank you. Across the district, we've seen that we've had staff and teacher shortages across the district. I say this to say that our students have been feeling our teachers being burnt out and not being able to have professional development time. You stated before that the professional development time could be implemented during planning periods. Often for many teachers, they are covering classes, looking at their curriculum, getting ready for their next class because they have been so overwhelmed with the amount of work that has to be done during the district, for the district. I love the thought of a teacher work day, and I am in favor of voting for November 1st because our students are feeling our teachers being overwhelmed, overworked, and for them to have a day to really understand professional development and not have to worry about it during the class time. I feel as though the class time that we would have missed would have been not as adequate if they were not given this day in order to have their professional development. I hope that everyone bears that in mind. I feel so bad for the elementary school parents, and I really hope that they can see why we're doing this and why this is a grave need for the district. Thank you.
All right. If there's no further discussion, I'm going to turn to Ms. De La Hara to make this motion.
Madam Chair, I move to approve the proposed change to the 2021-2022 CMS academic calendar as recommended by the superintendent. This change will designate Monday, November 1st, 2021 as a teacher workday instead of an instructional day.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion or debate?
I'll speak to my motion.
Oh, yes.
And I was saving my comments until, because I knew I would get to speak to the motion first. And many have already been stated, but since I took the time to write this out, bear with me and I will repeat that I am pleased to support this motion tonight. And I appreciate the thorough explanation from our staff and the superintendent about the need because of this state mandated training for, yes, pre-K-5, but also our other teachers who need this time for professional development. And I'm happy that this is apparently, from what I'm understanding, which was well explained tonight, really great professional development that our teachers and staff do need, but it's a lot. And I also, of course, have heard from the families who are struggling to find daycare, and so for their children. I think we can hold both of those things to be true at the same time. And in our society, we don't have to pit one against the other. It is true that there is an impact with every decision that we make on families. It is also true that our educators absolutely need this time. And if you are on the fence about that and not understanding, I would encourage you to watch the news tonight, because just at 5 o'clock earlier today, many of our educators were outside having a rally entitled "Pushed Too Far," because of all of the things that have already been mentioned tonight about all of the extra stressors related to COVID and our lack of teachers and substitutes and the additional training. It's a lot. And so I agree with what Brianna just said. I met with 5 students on Sunday who shared the exact same thing. They were high school students from 2 different high schools, that they are seeing the stress that our teachers right now and our educators are going through. So I would offer to the public that we take that into consideration. Well-rested, well-trained, well-planned teachers are going to perform better come November 3rd and provide a better quality experience for our students. So I'm happy to support this tonight. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Ms. Shipp and then Ms. Byers-Bailey.
I didn't have a comment.
Oh, you did not? Oh,
I was
okay.
not at this time.
Raising your finger in support. Ms. Byers-Bailey.
Thank you. I didn't speak to it earlier because I intended to second the motion. When this first came out, I got long emails from teachers who were in tears, just fried to the bone, ready to quit, just because they could not handle all the work that they needed to do in COVID with masks, and then to have this requirement dumped on them. And, they were saying, I can't do it. I'll just give up being the expert teacher that I so wanted to be for my students, because I cannot do this and do that too. I think Brianna, the students saw what the teachers were going through. We heard it in the emails. We had to do something to give them some relief. Thank you.
Ms. Cheek?
I am going to support this. I've been back and forth. And a couple people's eyes just went, really? She changed her mind again? I got more information today because I really wanted to know the timeline of when we knew and what we knew and how we could implement. I agree with you, Ms. De La Hara. Supporting this doesn't mean I don't care about the elementary school parents and they're struggling with childcare. I also want to just reiterate, I'm supporting this because of the mandatory letters training that's coming out and because we've got to get on this. I 100% understand the stress level and the anxiety and the mental exhaustion that exists within our staff, but I'm not approving a mental health day today. I'm approving an extra teacher work day so that we can tackle some professional development. That does not mean I don't care and respect that, because the mental health and social and emotional health of our staff and our students is a primary concern. But I don't want people to mistake and think that we have decided to take an extra teacher work day just for that. This is a huge professional development opportunity, both with the math curriculum for high schools and for letters to really get a strong kickoff. I'm venturing to say we're going to have 6,000 people doing professional development, hardcore mandated professional development on Monday. So I just want to reemphasize that. But I hope at the same time, the fact that we're doing this on a teacher workday then does relieve the burden that people have been carrying for the last few weeks since this packet came out to them. Like, how am I going to get all that done with all that extra things that I'm doing, and no planning time, no substitutes, no break time during the day. So, but I want us to just make sure that first and foremost, this is a professional development day on Monday for our teachers. And I am going to support it.
And now, Ms. Shipp.
I do, because I just thought about something that was really important. I had a teacher assistant to reach out to me, because they're even involved in the schools and in professional development, and they wanted to know, would they be able to be there to work and the support. The teacher assistants have been doing the subbing in schools. I don't know, and I want to shout out to them and tell them we really appreciate what they do. In many schools, there are no subs, and so they can't disperse. They are using those teacher assistants every day, and that pulls them away from some additional work they can do to support. But they were also concerned about being there for these work days, and I think that has been worked out. So thank you for that, and I just wanted to share that they all believe in the work that we need to do and how to support each other. So I wanted to do that, say that. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I make one more quick comment?
Okay.
Could I, please? Thank you. I did have one parent reach out to me and share that she had already worked it out with some of her fellow parents and teachers to cover classes in December to give teachers, the opportunity to do this. It was almost like, well, this is not needed. And it occurred to me, what a blessing for that particular teacher to have the parent support staff that for whatever reason maybe didn't have other work obligations or commitments that would give them the time to do that. And I'm grateful for that. Obviously that won't be needed now, but I'm just mentioning that because we do need to recognize in our community that not all schools have that sort of parent support system. And also, I guess a call to the general public that if you do find yourself in a blessed situation, maybe consider volunteering at other schools as well, because for particular reasons, there tend to be certain schools that have more resources and flexibility and access to parents who have that flexibility and other schools that don't. So just maybe think outside of the box how you might be able to help support some schools that maybe don't have those resources. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll sum that up to say, parents, we feel you. Teachers, we feel you. And sitting behind this dais, almost every single vote we take is a tough vote. So, and with that, I will call for the vote for Ms. De La Hara's nomination. All those in favor, let it be known by a show of hands. Any opposed? And that passes 8-1, Madam Clerk. Okay, so now if we can, we are going to move to our final item, which is some progress monitoring for math. And if we can bring Mr. Craybill, the facilitator, onto Zoom.
Good evening.
Good evening. Did we give you time to eat dinner with all of our debating?
Not quite. Next time, drag it out for a little bit more.
Okay. So let me just grab my notes for this. So colleagues, this is our second progress monitoring session with Mr. Craybill. One of our staff, we've been calling it practice. One of our staff pointed out maybe we should call it scaffolding because it's what our students do is scaffolding. So he's training us with the best way to approach these questions, but each time he's going to support a little bit less. But with that in mind, the floor is yours. You get to be the chair for a little bit here, Mr. Craybill.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's giving me flashbacks already. Before we dive into the scaffolding session, I just want a quick note on where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed. Where we've been is that the board has already identified a strategic plan, and the district has already been in the process of pursuing it. But what the board desired was a more clear set of metrics that they could use to monitor progress relative to that plan over time. So they could more clearly have an understanding of, do we need to be pivoting, or is the plan still the right direction and we need to be continuing to implement it with fidelity? The answer to how you do that is to have a clear set of metrics from the board's perspective, goals that describe the vision of the community for what students should know and be able to do, and guardrails that describe the values of the community that must be honored as the district pursues the goals. Once the board has identified the community's vision and values and codified those into a set of goals and guardrails, the next step is for the superintendent to identify interim metrics, metrics that can be looked at throughout the school year to identify, are we on the right track If we are, what can we be doing to accelerate our pace? If we're not, what are adjustments we need to make? It's not in the best interest of children to go an entire year without evaluating are we on the right path and making the necessary adjustments. Progress monitoring is a critical aspect of continuous improvement. And so the board, recognizing this, has taken the first step and laid out a set of potential goals and guardrails, and now is receiving from the administration, or will be receiving from the administration, a set of interims. Once all of those are available, the next step in the process is to conduct the monitoring itself, to actually spend time receiving monitoring reports from the administration on a monthly basis, really investing as much as half of the board's time each month, really figuring out, are students learning the things that we want them to learn? And if not, what are we doing about it? And if so, how are we accelerating it? Spending half the board's time there. But in order to do that, you have to have monitoring reports and you have to have a monitoring calendar. While those are in development, what the board's doing right now is actually putting in time building its muscle around monitoring. This is not an obvious function, just like PLCs in a school are not an obvious function. It takes some time, some energy to get better at them, and it helps to have a rubric that you can look at to guide your work. That's the work that the board is doing right now. In terms of next steps, moving forward from here, what will happen is the board will, once it's completed this part and the administration's completed their part, we'll come back together again and review those interim metrics to make sure that they are in alignment with the board's expectations. Once the full suite of goals, guardrails, interim guardrails, monitoring calendar, and a template for monitoring reports are all completed, ideally in January, we can transition out of the practice mode and into the implementation mode. So that's where we've been, that's where we are, and that's where we're going. Just quick check-in, board member, superintendent, any questions about where we've been, where we are, where we're going? Any clarification that you need about where we've been, where we are right now, what we're doing right now and why, or where we're going next before we proceed?
Anyone?
All right.
Like we're ready to charge on.
Then that being the case, we will dive right in. Board members, all right, that concludes that item. The next item on our agenda, board members, is our monitoring report. You have that report in front of you. Board members?
Yes.
Does the monitoring report have the 4 key things that a monitoring report needs to have for us to be able to conduct appropriate monitoring session? Go ahead and take a moment to look at the monitoring report. Before we start, just want to affirm that the monitoring report does have answer the 4 key questions that need to be answered in order for it to be a monitoring report that we can really use. If you're wondering where those 4 questions are, they're on the top of the second page of our progress monitoring document. There are 4 questions. The first one is, does it clearly state what's being monitored? The second is, does it clearly provide data, past, present, and future, relative to what's being monitored? The third question is, does it clearly identify the superintendent's evaluation of performance? And the fourth question is, does it provide evidence of that evaluation and information about next steps? So board members, as you're looking at the monitoring report, does it clearly have the 4 items that must be in a monitoring report in order for us as a board to be able to effectively monitor?
And does anybody need another copy of the monitoring report? We've got copies.
Let me have one.
There are
A couple packets we can send out. Madam Chair, I can.
And there's a couple more.
What about the report from Frank?
The actual, two. Okay. All right. So, does it clearly show what is being monitored?
Yes.
Where is that?
In the introduction.
It is, it talks about we're monitoring the math performance, the percent of students scoring 4 or 5 college level career ready on grade 5 and grade end of grade exams.
Absolutely.
Does it clearly show data for the 3 previous reporting periods and also the current reporting period?
Yes.
Yes, with the note that they're not actually comparable.
2018, 2019, and 2020.
Note that they're not actually.
On table 1 and table 2.
Yes.
Okay, I'm hearing a yes.
All right.
Does it clearly show the superintendent's evaluation of performance?
I'm not sure about that.
Yes.
Yes, because it has color-coded red for a decline on the data.
It speaks specifically.
Say that again, Ms. Sawyer?
Well, the data is color-coded, and the red tinted boxes show declines.
Yep.
But does that really speak to the superintendent's evaluation of performance specifically?
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm asking the question, is it clearly, though, showing the superintendent's evaluation of performance? I guess that would be. Is it
Well,
clearly?
it's the next paragraph that addresses that, not the chart, but that's the
That's-
next paragraph,
that
in
was-
examining our mathematics performance.
That's exactly what I was-
Commentary to
It's
it.
not just in the chart.
Yeah.
So is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay.
You can use that.
So the last question, does it clearly show supporting documentation that gives evidence of the superintendent's valuation? And if the district is not at target, or the superintendent's evaluation indicates that implementation is not on track, does the monitoring report clearly describe any needed next steps?
Yes.
Yes. On page 3 of 5.
Page 3.
Needed next steps.
All right, so I'm hearing a yes, that we're off track and needed next steps are listed. So I think that's a yes
All right.
to all 4.
So I would not answer a yes to all 4. So step 1, does it clearly identify what is being monitored? Yes, it shares what's being monitored. The percent of students scoring level 4 or 5 on grade 5 and grade 8 through grade ELA exams. My recommendation to the superintendent, don't bury the lead. In the future, just instead of having that embedded in a paragraph, leave it there embedded in the paragraph. That's not problematic. But have that somewhere just clearly distinguished by itself so the board members don't have to look to find it. They should never have to look to know what the document is about. And the fact that it took them more than 2 seconds to figure that out means that it is obfuscated beyond what is appropriate. Question number 2 is it clearly show the data for that metric? No, it does not clearly show the data for that metric. It shows data for disaggregated elements of that metric, but it does not clearly show the percentage of students who are scoring a level 4 or 5 on the grade 5 and grade 8 end of grade ELA exams. That percentage is not shown in the tables below. What's shown is the disaggregated data looking at grade 5 and the disaggregated data looking at grade 8, but that is not the metric that's board approved and described above. Does that distinction make sense?
It does say, but it does say percent college and career ready, which we know is 4 and 5 in a all aggregated, the top line. Does that not fall into?
Yeah, all.
It says all with the 3 years current state comparison. CCR is 4 and 5.
Point to the item that somebody tell me what is the percentage of students scoring level 4 or 5 on the grade 5th and grade 8th end of grade ELA exams. Someone tell me what the current percentage for that is.
So you want
So 5 and 8 aggregated.
Yeah, it's not really there.
Well,
Why would we-
29.6
for
for
five.
5 and 19.8.
No, that's not what the
Aggregate
metric
5 and
says. Somebody tell me, what is the percentage of students scoring level 4 or 5 on the grade 5 and grade 8 end of grade ELA exam?
It's not there.
It's not there. Not in that.
So combining the two.
Can someone tell me that percentage?
So it needed to be combined?
Yeah, the way he's talking.
Look up here.
I do too. It's not there, AJ.
It is not present. And so it is valuable to have the disaggregated data, but it is not acceptable not to have the actual data point that the board is requesting. Does that distinction make sense for folks?
Yes, but I don't think we asked for an aggregated 5th and 8th grade, but maybe I'm misunderstanding.
The board approved, what is the board approved metric?
Well, this is coming from the previous strategic plan, which was
I'm-
not SMART goals, and so.
I understand that.
So we'll just need to be very specific. I mean, I personally, I don't think that's a great, I don't know that that's a really, a number I can do a lot with to combine 5th and 8th. I want to see what 5th graders look like. I want to see what 8th graders look like. So we'll have to be careful how we write that up.
And that is the takeaway message. That is exactly the point you should be taking away from this conversation. The board has to be absolutely crystal clear on what it expects, and the administration needs to provide the board with exactly what it requested. That is not occurring in this document. Make sure which is why we're practicing now, you ideally will never miss that phenomenon should it happen again. I suspect it'll never happen again, but should it happen, it's not acceptable for you as board members to miss that the data that you've asked for has not been presented, that a disaggregated form has been, and it should be. There's value to having the disaggregated version, but the board should get what it's requested. And to be clear, if what the board requested is dumb, the board should still get that. The message is you want to be really intentional about what you're requesting and make sure that it's what you actually intend. But whatever it is, whether it is a good idea or not, that is what the administration is obligated to share with the board.
AJ, so I'm looking at the targets in the 2024 strategic plan.
Yes.
And the 5th grade math and 8th grade math are disaggregated. There is a target for 5th grade math and a target for 8th grade math. So I understand what you're saying, but our strategic plan has 2 different numbers in it for that. One for 5th grade math and one for 8th grade math.
In that case, what this needs to say at the top of it is not what it currently says. It needs to actually indicate there are 2 different things that are being monitored in this, not treat them as one. Remember, the audience for monitoring reports isn't just the board. You should be able to hand this to any parent, any community member, any staff member, and without having to work to digest it, without having to work to understand it, they should immediately be clear about what is the board's expectation and where are we at as a school system relative to that expectation. If it takes us 10 minutes into the conversation to get clear on this point, then we're not there yet, which is the whole value of taking time to practice, is because these are exactly the sort of things that we sift through in advance of doing this for real, ideally starting in January. Other questions or comments about this? All right, so that brings us to the third question. Does it clearly articulate the superintendent's evaluation of performance?
I didn't really think it did. I didn't think it was.
Hello?
I think everyone's
I didn't think it was clear. I didn't think it was clear.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So what happened was different people started looking around, everybody trying to interpret, well, is it the red? Is it, this thing that's in black? Is it this paragraph down here? The fact that you all are looking means it's not sufficiently clear. And again, this is why we practice. This is why football camp starts more than a week before the first football game. It's because we got to level up. That's all. And so we're exactly where we need to be. But the fact that you all were looking around and identified multiple different things means it's simply, as a point of fact, it is not clear what the superintendent's evaluation of performance is. So ways that I would recommend upgrading this document for future purposes. One, don't bury the lead. Put whatever is being monitored, whatever the metrics, very clearly at the top of the document. If you're measuring two different things, then indicate that you're measuring two different things, but don't treat it as if you're measuring one thing. Next, I would put the actual line graph, not a table. I find line graphs to be a lot more digestible by community members. I put actual line graph all the way somewhere at the top of the document so people don't have to dig around to look. In the line graph, the benefit of having prior data, current data, future data is because then it's a real easy trend line for anyone to follow. You don't have to have a PhD in psychometrics in order to sort that out. And then I would, somewhere in close proximity to that, but clearly distinct from that, have in bold, clear letters by itself, not stashed away in a paragraph anywhere, clearly articulated was the superintendent's evaluation of performance. That way, those item 1, 2, and 3, nobody has to look for, nobody has to try to interpret, nobody has to try to guess around. Once you've got that in place, the rest of the document is actually rock solid. The administration's ability to interpret the data, really interrogate it for meaning, and then offer some coherent insights into what's happening and what's happening next. Like all of that is solid. Which, to be clear, if I had to have one thing that I'd really want to be rock solid at this point, it would be that. It means your administration's thinking in terms of monitoring is exactly where it needs to be. All we're changing is the presentation of the document. It's much better to have presentation level changes to make than to have thinking level changes to make. So I realize I'm being very direct with you all. That's because you don't ever want to make these mistakes again. These are conversations that we had in part last time as well. We should not be having this conversation next time we do one of these sessions. And so that's why I'm being very direct, because not again.
AJ, can I ask a question?
But once we've got those sorted out, then we'll be in a position to proceed. So if this was actually monitoring report that came before you as a board, my coaching to you would be to hand it back to the superintendent and say, go ahead and sharpen this up a little bit, and we will take this up at our next meeting rather than right now. I do not encourage the board to spend time on a monitoring report that doesn't clearly answer those four questions. And so if you ever find yourself in a position like we're in right now, the appropriate step is to hand it back to the superintendent, that we will give you opportunity to finish your homework, and then we will take this up at a future date. For now, for scaffolding purposes, we'll go ahead and proceed anyway, just so that we can get some more reps in. What questions or comments do you have before we proceed?
Ms. Delahara.
Thank you. I have one quick question. This second paragraph, considerations, statewide accountability changes, it's rather lengthy, but it's really important. There continues to be so much misinformation in our community about what happens with students who take Math 1 in middle school and those grades not being reported. So would you suggest that all of that stay, but just be moved to the end? In your comments about don't bury the lead, like to have those first four things up front and have this sort of commentary there, but just later in the report.
Yeah, so I'd have questions 1, 2, and 3 answered at the very top of the document, very clearly, unmistakable, unmissable. And then everything else is basically question 4, and then you can organize that however it makes the most sense. And I happen to agree with management. I think putting this item, considerations, as high up on the document as possible is incredibly wise. So as a practical matter, what you might wind up with is a document that's slightly reorganized, where the section about considerations is the bottom half of page 1, and questions 1, 2, and 3 are answered in the top half of page 1. Okay. And then everything else basically just kind of bumps down to wherever it needs to be and stays the exact same.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, as much as we're being clear about other pieces that aren't there yet, I want to be clear about the rest of the document that is there. Again, the critical thinking component, the component, frankly, that I often find least present in these type of documents, and it takes a lot of coaching of administrations to get to. That's not a problem here, and that is a very good thing for you all to know is not a problem here. Other questions or comments about the document before we dive back into actually the monitoring conversation?
I have a process question.
Yeah.
I think some others submitted questions in writing in advance.
Yes.
Should we have expected like a document answering our collective questions in advance? No.
That is a great question. So in you all's processes, there's an increased encouragement to submit questions in advance of board meetings. But you're actually submitting questions for two different purposes. So we're encouraging you to submit questions about all the different board items, things that will be voted on, all of that. Submit that in advance. So to the extent that there are really basic issues and basic items of inquiry, that those can be sorted out in advance. That way, the cognitive load of sorting through that is addressed offline so that in the board meeting, you're really digging into the heart of the matter. Asking incredibly elementary questions at the board table is not the most optimal use of your time. And conspires to give you all the incredibly lengthy and arguably valuable meetings that you sometimes find yourself experiencing. And so having more questions up front to really get a lot of the basics out of the way so that you can really get to the meat of the matter in the board meetings, that's very important. And so in that context, you're asking questions that should be answered in writing in advance and that likely won't be asked again in the meeting, because the purpose is to save time to get to the weightier topics rather than the more elementary topics. In the context of monitoring, it's actually very different. You're asking questions in advance, largely to do your own preparation. This is a form of preparation for yourself as a board member, but also to give the administration an opportunity to put together the best possible data and information for you. So that in the board meeting, instead of hearing the superintendent say, we don't know, we'll get that together, we'll get back to you, the superintendent can say, thank you for that question, we've looked into that, and here's the most accurate information we have available. And so where in every other area, we're asking you to submit questions in advance, specifically so they won't come up again at the board meeting. In this context, asking questions in advance does not preclude them from coming back up, but also the administration should not try to answer them in the monitoring report. The monitoring report, by definition, is always going to be 3 pages, 5 pages, absolute max. And so instead of using that space for an FAQ, the conversation just needs to happen organically at the dais. And so if you submit a question, it's for monitoring purposes, it's still totally appropriate to ask that question during the monitoring conversation if you still want a public answer to it. So that's, in that regard, the question that you submit in advance for monitoring is entirely distinct from all of the questions you're submitting in advance about items on the board agenda. Let me pause for a second. Is that distinction between questions to help advance the monitoring, which may still be asked again, versus questions to dispense with elementary topics, which won't be asked again, does that distinction make sense for folks, or was I not clear in that?
Makes sense to me.
Seeing head nods.
Perfect. Other questions before we dive back in?
So yeah, I do. Just a follow-up on what Carol asked. So strategic questions, of course, this is for strategic questions, but some of the questions we submitted in advance were tactical and technical questions. Mm-hmm. That's not for tonight, right? Those should be answered in writing, but that's not for the conversation
not quite.
tonight.
By far, the most valuable use of your time in monitoring is to have a strategic conversation. Spending time in monitoring with the full board, the cabinet, the superintendent, and everybody who's watching present, talking about what's happening in an individual building or with an individual staff member or an individual program, that is not the highest and best use of your time in monitoring. This is one of those times when you're really trying to be intentional, where you're trying to engage in generative conversation that is of a strategic nature. This is specifically time for the board to engage strategically. So much else of what you do is not strategic, it's tactical. It's responding to the phenomenon of operations that has to be dealt with or the latest fire that has to be put out. But that doesn't have you forwarding what's possible for children, that just has you making sure the trains are on time. This monitoring is your opportunity to engage in strategic conversation, generative conversation that ideally helps give rise to performance improvements for students. As such, that is where you want to spend your time. So much so that during the conversation, the board chair should only entertain strategic questions unless there are other questions that have been submitted in advance that are of a tactical or technical nature. And then if the board chair feels like these really do contribute to us having a more strategic conversation, then I would call them admissible if they were submitted in advance. If they're not submitted in advance, all technical and tactical questions should be immediately brushed aside by the board chair. Say, hey, superintendent, jot those down. Go ahead and email us answers to those at the end of the week. And so there are going to be times when board members will want to inject some amount of technical or tactical level questions, non-strategic questions, into a monitoring conversation. If those aren't submitted at least 3 days in advance, they're completely banned, and the board chair should treat them as such and brush them aside and not even entertain them. They should be called out of order. They are indication that the board member failed to do their duty to children by preparing in advance, and that lack of preparation should not be a problem for the board and the superintendent. However, if folks do think that that's something important enough and contributes to a strategic conversation, and so they want to submit technical and tactical questions in advance, then that should be the signal to the superintendent. This may come up and I need to be prepared for it. But if it's not received by the superintendent at least 3 days in advance, then the superintendent should not be prepared for that and should instead be prepared specifically to lean into a strategic question. What questions do you have about the difference between technical, tactical, strategic level questions and when and where they are and aren't appropriate? What questions do you all have about that? I feel like I threw a lot at you, so I just want to check in.
So much.
Mr. Strain?
So, AJ, can I run one by you and see where it lands? So last year in grade 8 mathematics for the EOGs, we had 20% of our students score 4 or 5. 20% of our students were college and career ready.
Yes.
Obviously, that means 80% were not. And so I would have a question, for example, that says there is a Foundations of Math course that's offered in high school that's actually a prep course for Math 1. This effectively says 80% of our kids probably are not ready to do Math 1. So my question would be, are those kids then, the 80%, tracked to this Foundations course prior to going to Math 1? So strategic,
that is
tactical.
clearly a tactical question.
Okay.
And so the technical version. So the technical version of that question might be, superintendent, what's the correlation between the student group that took this course and the student group that didn't, relative to their ability to pass this? Well, superintendent's not going to know that. But at that point, you're asking a math question. That's technical. You're not asking that, but you are asking a tactical question. Here's the strategic version of that. Is just simply one layer up. Superintendent, I noticed 80% of our students, are missing the bar. What is our strategy for addressing that? The key difference between these two questions is you are assuming that you know what the correct strategic approach is, and that you've already picked a tactic to match that strategy. What I'm suggesting to you is do not make that assumption in the monitoring. In fact, what you are doing in monitoring is you're not trying to inform the superintendent during a monitoring conversation. There are plenty of other times where you can inform the superintendent. During a monitoring conversation, you want to know what the superintendent believes. You want to know what the superintendent knows. So in the back of your mind, you may be thinking, I bet the right answer is that we should be doing this thing. In monitoring, what you're trying to figure out is, does the superintendent see the same thing you see or not? And so in that context, Judge Superintendent, what's our strategy for addressing this, obvious issue? And at that point, either the superintendent is going to lift up something that sounds exactly like what you think, or is going to miss it entirely. But as a board member, you want to know if the superintendent doesn't have, in your estimation, clear thinking about how best to address this. You want to know that. And so that's why you don't want to signal, here is the tactic I think we should be using. You want to leave it at a strategic level and let the superintendent show you what he does or doesn't know. Is that responsive to your inquiry, Sean?
It is, thank you.
Ms. Shipp?
And my question would be, it may be similar, but I think I'm looking at strategies. So I would be asking the question, for example, we talk about the need for staff to have good training and professional development. In order to do this, for example, open up math. And it has been here maybe since, let me get right, I think it came in 2018 maybe. And yet we're still saying there's a need to strengthen core instruction with this math program. So what are we saying here in terms of being able to teach? Are we accelerating or doing too much remedial teaching here, or just-in-time teaching?
Yeah, and so essentially what you've done is you've made it a multiple choice. And what that assumes is that one of the choices that you provided is the correct choice. Not only do you not know that, even if you do know that, that's not what you want to use monitoring for. What you want to know, more important than if you know the right choice, is you want to know what?
The superintendent knows the
Does
right
the superintendent?
Does the superintendent know
That's
the
what
right
I'm
choice?
like, right.
And your access to that isn't through offering a multiple choice. It's saying, hey, this is, I'm looking at this data in table 2, it's telling me this. What is the appropriate response? What is the best response for curing this? And then seeing what the superintendent surfaces. And either the superintendent is saying stuff similar to you, or the superintendent is seeing things very differently. And as a board member, you want to know if he's seeing things very differently, because you want to understand why, with his perspective in the school system, is he seeing things differently than you are. Maybe he knows about a curriculum that's more effective than the ones you know about. Maybe he knows about a staffing circumstance that impacts this that you're not familiar with. But you want to know what he knows. And so the temptation that you want to avoid in monitoring, that is not monitoring at all, is offering the superintendent advice and saying, here's this strategy, are you going to use it or not? Kind of this binary phenomenon, this yes/no question, isn't monitoring, that's advising. But similarly, offering a multiple choice. Hey, we could be doing this, this, or this. Which one of these 3 are you going to do? Right. Is also offering advice. It's absolutely not a form of a monitoring conversation. It's not helping you understand organically and completely what the superintendent knows. It's inviting the superintendent to play multiple choice with you, which may lead him to give you answers that aren't the ones that he would have come up with on his own. And what you really want to know is, what would he have come up with on his own?
So how would you turn that into a monitoring question?
I say, hey, I noticed that on table 2, I noticed that in 2018, 46% were college and career ready. But right now, it's all the way down to 19.6%. What has caused that? Mm-hmm. And let him identify what he believes the precipitating causes are for that massive decline. And to be blunt, I'm hoping he says something more than we had a pandemic. Like, ideally, he and his team have looked into it and come up with a little bit more clarity, both about how we got here and about how he believes that we're going to proceed to repair the harm that's been done to children.
Thanks. Sawyer? Or is that enough?
That's good.
Okay.
Right. I wanted to get to how that question would be monitored.
Yeah.
So I'm going to refer to one of the questions that I emailed in, but it refers to the discussion at the bottom of page 2 about differences in performance at schools with in low poverty, moderate and high poverty schools. I could read the paragraph if that's helpful, or read the sentence that as concentrations of poverty increased, the percent of students college and career ready in mathematics decreased. In grade 5, 51.3% of students in low poverty schools were college and career ready, compared to 17.2 and 7.1 in our moderate and high poverty schools, respectively. In grades 8, 36.1% of students in low poverty schools were college and career ready, compared to 5.6 and less than 5% in our moderate and high poverty schools, respectively. So my questions are, to what do you attribute the disparity based on SES, and what both long and short-term strategies do you plan to employ to eliminate this disparity?
It's a great monitoring conversation to have. And so two things that you did that are worth noting. And by the way, the rest of the board members have been good at this as well. First, you pointed to a specific data set. In these monitoring reports, it is not useful for you to pull data from, Twitter, Facebook, your own understanding, email. What you really want to do is you want to do exactly what you all have done universally tonight. You all have pointed specifically to data that's in the monitoring report. This is actually a little bit unusual. Often I run into boards and they've got all kind of other sources. Well, Ray told me that. Ray's not part of the monitoring conversation. What you want to do is you want to dig into the data that is presented and focus in on that and ask questions based on that. So the first thing that you did that was really high quality there, and again, all of you have been doing this, is you pointed to a specific data somewhere on the monitoring report. Stick with that. That is what highly effective monitoring conversations are grounded in, the actual data. So the second thing you did is you asked a question that encouraged the superintendent to look backwards. How did we get here? And then you asked a question that's totally appropriate in monitoring, which is to invite the superintendent to look forward. How are we getting out of where we're currently at? What you did not do, which is, again, is excellent practice, is you didn't insert your own ideas of, here's what I think you should do, superintendent. Don't you think the same? Or aren't you going to do this? Instead, you're leaving it open to figure out, does my CEO know how to be the CEO? And that is an important and critical part of monitoring. Remember, this is formative evaluation of the superintendent. Instead of evaluating the superintendent one time per year, essentially you're doing micro evaluations of the superintendent every single month that the superintendent is a superintendent. This is really valuable for a board because it gives us accelerated confidence that our superintendent, our chief executive, is on top of things and knows what is going on with the learning of children, or it exposes that the superintendent does not know that. Either way, that's information the board wants. The type of questions you ask help you get at that because they weren't leading, they weren't offering advice or any of that thing. So yeah, great examples of monitoring questions, and certainly very valuable to submit those in advance because that allows your superintendent to have really done its homework and be well prepared.
So do I get the answer now?
I'm not prepared for the answer for you right now. But in a moment, we'll dive back into the monitoring conversation. And yes, ask that. Any other clarifications before we dive back into the role play?
I have one. I don't know if it's, again, I'm not sure if this is too leading or if it's too tactical or if it's strategic. So I'm looking at Table 3. Table 3, which breaks down Math 1 in high school by race and gender. And I'm focusing specifically on race. And I'm wondering about if we're measuring access to highly effective teachers, highly effective Math 1 teachers, and if so, if there's a correlation between that and these racial breakdowns. So for example, if we have a school that's primarily Black and Hispanic students, what is their access to highly effective teachers compared to a school that's primarily white or Asian students? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, are we measuring that? How are we measuring that? Is there a correlation?
Yeah, so just as a general rule, if the answer to your question would require another table, that's probably indication that you're asking a very technical question. Again, which doesn't make it inappropriate, it just makes it inappropriate to spring it on the superintendent. So if you were studying this monitoring report, a week in advance, whenever you receive it, you think, you know what, this particular question would really help me understand where we're at and kind of how we're deploying strategically, then I would consider that a technical question that I would definitely then, in that context, submit to the superintendent at least 3 days in advance, so that they have time and he can decide, whether or not, he's going to slip an extra table in response to that, or if he's just going to have that table handy for himself, so that he can speak to the question. But generally speaking, if the answer to your question really requires the development of another table, that's a dead giveaway that it is a technical question rather than tactical or strategic. And again, in this context, I hear exactly what you're asking for, and I think that could well contribute to the board's understanding of some of the strategies that the superintendent refers to in the next section, in the needed next section. If that's how you feel, I would just make sure to, in your mind, have flagged it as a technical question, for your own learning and edification. Like, you want to be clear about the nature of the questions you're asking. So I'd send it to the superintendent, have got a technical question that would help me understand your next steps, and then submit your technical question, 3, preferably 4, 5, 6, 7 days in advance. And then that becomes a fair question to ask during the monitoring conversation.
Elise, I had submitted a version of that question that was actually based off not Table 3, but about a statement that said our new math curriculum is conceptual and many of our teachers are still learning about this approach and shifting their instructional practice. And the question is, are teachers who are best able to teach the new curriculum deployed in schools with the highest needs? So is that?
That's yes, no.
That's a yes, no. So, okay. Are teacher resources deployed in a way to maximize achievement in underperforming subgroups? So it's a.
Yeah, so there are a couple things going on here. One, you're looking for a strategic question in response to tactical data. That's what's actually happening here. and so I applaud you for looking for a strategic question. What's happened is your superintendent has included some very tactical elements into his description of next steps. I generally discourage this, only because it tends to lead, and most people don't do what you did. Most people will see a tactical question and respond to it with more tactical questions and more technical questions. What you did is you took a tactical question and figured out what's the strategic thing to ask above it. What would have actually made your job easier is if, rather than presenting the kind of this tactical view of what's happening with their implementation work, because that's exactly what's being described here. It's describing the nature of their implementation, which is essentially the definition of tactical. I would encourage the superintendent to lean away from including tactical descriptions in these sections and focus on the strategic. Particularly what's valuable is items that fall into 2 categories: things that will require board support or things that will require board action. The nature of whether or not the curriculum is conceptual or not rises to neither of those. This will not take board action. It will not take, and it probably won't benefit from significant amount of board support. And so I'd encourage the superintendent, as you're thinking about descriptions of what's happening organizationally, I try to focus on things that actually clarify what is the board's role? Like, what can the board do to make a difference for children? The board can't do anything about that sentence. There's nothing the board can do about that. But if you identify what's the strategic challenge that we're facing, and here's what we're doing about that, but we're going to need some board support because it's probably going to be uncomfortable for some staff, and we're going to need and so you're going to get complaints, and we need you to stand behind it. And here's why. Here's the data that suggests why we're making this shift. That's helpful because it gets at what is the support you need for the board. Or if it's action, hey, you know what? We actually need a new math curriculum, even though we paid for one 2 years ago that was supposed to last us 5 years. It's not the curriculum is not working. We need to switch to a different one. You're going to see a request for that in the annual budget in 3 months. And I want you to know right now, that's why we're requesting that, is because the data is telling us that the current curriculum is, is not working for folks. Or we need a massive influx of professional development above and beyond what we normally spend, but we're gonna have to pay teachers extra for that, in addition to paying the professional development provider, and that's why you're going to see this, additional $6 million expenditure that you wouldn't normally see, and we're going to need you all to vote to approve that because it's inconsistent with our current budget. That's an example of putting something in there that describes board action. The item in there is truly tactical. There's nothing for the board to do, and so it's inadvisable to insert it. The issue needs to be addressed, but I just address it strategically rather than tactically. Mr. Superintendent, is that distinction make sense to you?
It does, and I have a clarifying question, Mr. Crable.
Yeah.
So based on your feedback, if I look at the item or the 2 paragraphs on page 5,
yeah,
what I'm hearing you say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you would have prioritized the first paragraph, which
Absolutely.
is an action that the board took tonight in order to help improve the outcomes that we're hoping to get. That would have been listed first instead of
Absolutely.
On the back end. Okay.
Because that gives clear insight into, as the chief executive, what do I need from my board in terms of either action or support in order to help us further the mission of improving student outcomes. And so putting stuff in here that they can't really do anything about just is going to leave them frustrated at best, misguided at worst.
I have a clarifying question too then. So ultimately, we will be getting progress monitoring reports throughout the year for 12
That's right.
months. But that does not mean we have an expectation of board action with every single, like a vote to go along with every single monitoring report, right? It might be, maybe we'll get a report in May after we've already built the budget for the coming year. And the report might be something, or like August or September, early on in the school year, and the report might suggest, well, in next year's budget, we're going to need your support with XYZ, right? I mean, is it like future support and present support?
It should most definitely be future action, future support. If, like, every now and then there will be something that, hey, here's a pivot that we need to make right now, and it just so happens it requires board action. Like that'll come up, and so that's not anything to be worried about. But generally speaking, the next steps, sections of these as it relates to the board should be things that are looking down the road. Ideally, your superintendent has enough operational autonomy built into your policies that if he needs to move a few teachers around or make some curricular changes or adjust the master schedule or things like that, these are things that ideally don't require a board meeting. Like, he should have the operational autonomy to be the chief manager of the school system. And so what's usually winds up being in here are things that are signaling, hey, down the road, here's some major changes. So for example, if you were going to do a major reclassification of positions, normally you would just do that once per year. And so he might say, hey, we need to reclassify all these positions. They are currently classified as, coordinators, and we need to reclassify them as specialists. But we're not going to do that in the middle of the year. So you may be receiving this in October. What that really means is next June, when we're adopting the budget, you're going to see these reclassifications. You're going to see the financial impact of that, and we'll need action on that, and we'll need support from that next August when it really starts to impact people that we've reclassified these positions. But that's a full 9 months away. Those are the sort of things that really show that your administration is being incredibly thoughtful and projecting, not just running from fire to fire. Like, your superintendent should not be a firefighter. The superintendent hires some firefighters, no doubt, but the superintendent, firefighting is not strategic work, it's tactical work. And so you really want your superintendent looking further down the road and bringing things to you that are projecting in the future. Here are things that we're going to need some adjustments we're going to need to make. Here's why. And so just be expecting that to come. Now, to be clear, in your first your first cycle of monitoring, your administration is learning this process as well. So don't have any expectations of perfection, in the same way you wouldn't expect a first-year teacher to be flawless in every aspect of the game. Don't expect, a first cycle progress monitoring administration to be flawless in every aspect of the game. But you should expect that fairly quickly, over 6 to 12 months into this, that the superintendent is getting better and better at forecasting for the board major things coming down the tracks that are going to require board action and board support.
Okay.
Other inquiries before we get into folks getting into the conversation to practice.
John has a question.
Yeah, so AJ, quick question on currency, and we talked about this last time too, but so the data in here is 6 months old, right? These tests were taken 6 months ago. And so since then we've had, I can think of 2 sets of data that would be interesting, that would actually, so in this report it says, the section that says, how will we know if our strategy is working? And so what would you expect in terms of the currency of the data?
Yeah.
Right? So
this is an excellent question, and I'm grateful for you asking this. And so in the guidance document that I hand out to the administrations, and I'm realizing now this is not in the guidance document that I gave your administration, I will correct that deficiency this evening. So I apologize. That is my error, not your administration's. But I will get them the correct guidance document this evening before I go to bed. But in the guidance document that I generally offer administrations, they should be targeting providing a monitoring report to the board 30 to 60 days after the data was collected and becomes available. So because the intention of monitoring is to really be able to, in near real time, these should be leading indicators, not lag indicators. So it's not real-time data. This is not formative data. It's interim data. And so it's near real-time, but not quite. So generally, you should expect data to be 30 to 60 days stale by the time you all are looking at it. But that's perfectly fine for strategic level decision-making. For tactical level decision-making, you need the freshest possible data, but you all aren't tacticians, so you're fine without that. But if it's more than 30 to 60 days stale, then at that point, it's even hard to make meaningful strategic decisions, or to even report on what the current strategic repositioning is, because you're already repositioning based on an even newer set of data. And so that is not in the guidance document that I provided your administration. It is in the guidance document that I'll provide to them this evening, so they'll have access to that. So as they're thinking through what are appropriate interim goals, appropriate interim guardrails, they'd be thinking about, is this data so for example, it wouldn't make sense if something was collected in May, provided to the administration in August, for them to come to you in September with that. Because even though the data was made available to them in August, the data was collected in May. The date of collection is clearly 60 days out. And I gauge that based on when data collection closed. So sometimes you've got data collection windows that are open for 4 weeks. Hey, we've got kids starting this particular assessment, and they'll be rolling through that assessment through different schools based on their calendars over the next 4 weeks. But at the end of that 4 weeks, when that assessment window closes, that's when you really want to start that 60-day clock, that ideally no more than 60 days after assessment window closes and the data comes back. That's assuming a real-time data collection system. That's not always the case. But if they're doing it online, and so they have the data back pretty much within a week of the window closing, then 60 days out from there is the window inside of which you'd want information provided back to the board. But if it gets significantly beyond that, it's just going to be really hard for the data to be meaningful in exactly the way that you expressed.
If I could just provide a point of clarity, and these are all points well taken, so thank you. This is actually the last monitoring report that will be focused on lagging data. Moving forward, beginning next month, we will be focusing on leading indicators.
Oh, that's good.
Well, and to be clear, for these practice sessions, I advise the administration not to spend a lot of time putting together the most real version of data. This is, from my perspective, this is largely dummy data, and that's the direction I encourage your administration just for the sake of practicing. But when we get into actual monitoring, yes, you will have data that is more of a leading data nature, that's more interim rather than summative.
But just for clarification for the public too, this data, which is so important, which so many people look at and talk about, we don't have access to it until 3 months after it's collected. So, I mean, there's no way it can be fresh. And so, again, it's a problem. I mean, it is what it is. There's just nothing we do about that.
What it means as a practical matter for monitoring is your interim goals need to be based on something that is predictive, that isn't data that you, generally speaking, it's not a good idea to have interim goals be data that you don't control. And so if you're sitting around waiting for the state to produce some data, it's probably not a great idea to build interim goals based on that. Like, you want data that your administration, your superintendent really has authority over, and can tell you, you know what, we had to hold our, we had, 4 schools go in lockdown, and so we had to hold the assessment window open for an extra 10 days, an extra 2 weeks. And so that's why this data won't be available in its regular monitoring cycle. Like, you want that level of clarity around data abnormalities from your superintendent. You're not going to get that consistently if it's state-owned data rather than district-owned data.
So you're talking about interim. So Sean, did you have follow-up?
Well, I think we covered it, right? So one of the things that we just started talking about was the formative versus summative data, and just making sure we were clear as to what that actually represented, right? So, Mr. Superintendent, you talked about this is the last one that's going to use that set of data. In the future, we're going to use a different set of data. Can you give an example of what sort of data we would expect to see in the next progress monitoring report?
So moving forward, an example of a data set that board members can expect to discuss and receive as part of the progress monitoring report would be our MAP data, which is our academic screener. And so that's an example of the data that we can expect to discuss in future monitoring reports.
And my district, for example, the district, where I work, we use MAP. The district that I was working with earlier today, that's going through the same process that you are, they're using iReady. I mean, there's a variety of different tools out there. What's common among them is that these are generally norm-referenced adaptive assessments that are given on an interim basis. These aren't formative assessment tools, not designed to be at least, but they are appropriate for this particular usage. And so, yeah, MAP is fairly common.
I just wanted to ask that too. Will we expect to be seeing other types of formative or quarterly data that will be coming? Because there's plenty of data really actually schools are collecting quarterly. I mean, it starts monthly, but then quarterly. So, and then semester type data. So are we going to be expected to see that as well?
Just a quick reminder that when this progress monitoring report was sent, it was sent along with a calendar of what to expect coming up. There were 2 attachments.
Yeah, we saw actually what we would be looking at, and I think we're asking, like, for example, we knew we would be looking at math, but do we know how that data would be collected on the math?
MAP data for MAP testing?
Ms. Schiff, are you referring to math or are you referring to?
Yeah, I wasn't saying maps, I was saying math. Like when we're looking at math data, right, for 5th and 8th grade.
Oh, MATH, not MAP.
Right. And I guess what I'm saying is we want to look at what kind of data you collecting quarterly, right? What does that look like? I guess I'm saying on-time data as opposed to data that we collected back at the beginning of the year or end of the year.
I think the masks are are muffling map and math.
M-A-T-H, math.
So for example, on the document that Chairwoman Dashy referenced, in January, we will be focused on advanced courses. And so examples of math data that we will discuss will be honors math, grade 6. We will also talk about math 1, grade 8. So those are two examples that we'll be discussing as part of our January progress monitoring session.
Right.
Is that helpful, Ms. Schiff?
Right, that kind of answers it, because I was looking at exactly what type of assessments would we be using, along with what we, yeah.
So there are many assessments.
And to help you all, as board members, the guidance that I have provided your administration is they really want to look for data that has a moderate to strong correlation with the data in the summative assessment. And so when I say moderate to strong, I generally say, 0.5 correlation or higher, I'd work with. Some people are comfortable with slightly lower than that. I'm not as much so. At that, you get much lower than that. What I would encourage administration is maybe you need to be looking at a different assessment, or a different way of deploying the assessment such that it results in a higher correlation. But I mentioned that, board members, to be clear, it's not actually appropriate for the administration to grab really any data off the shelf that might be available within the school system. If it doesn't have a high degree of correlation with the summative, then it's not actually appropriate for the use because it won't help you predict the future. The whole point of a strong correlation between interim data and summative data is that you have a pretty good idea of what the future is going to be. And so if you grab an assessment that board members like more, but that it actually has a lower correlation, you've actually just locked yourselves into less information about the future, not more. And so that is a thing that you have to consider. It's not a function of, is this the data that we like most? It's the function of, is this the data that most accurately predicts the future relative to the summative assessment that we're deploying? And so that can be a tough pill to swallow sometimes for boards, because there probably is data that you'll hear about from staff, from families, that they actually appreciate more for a variety of reasons. But if it's actually less predictive, while it may be great for other purposes, it's not great for this purpose of monitoring.
Thank you.
Other questions, clarifications before we transition?
Can we just explain, or I guess I'm lost in the formative versus summative. If we drill into one area, say math, right? Our math curriculum.
M-A-T-H.
M-A-T-H curriculum. Our math curriculum, I believe, has not only the summative assessment at the end, but has interim assessments or formative assessments. And so I don't think that is MAP data. I think that is formative assessments that take place during the course. And so would those be appropriate? Because it seems to me, and I think these are the quarterly assessments that you were talking about, right, Lenora, in terms of bringing those forward and saying, we've done these formative assessments, not because we want to do a test, but because that's the way that we teach. And we want to bring forward those formative assessments and the results because they're a clear indicator of two things. Number one, what still needs to be done. So we're using that data to guide our teaching and learning. And we're going to share those up to say, this is how we're progressing toward our summative goals. And I don't think that example, I don't think is in here. Whereas some things like Math 1 by grade 8 progression, I think that is how many of our 8th graders have enrolled in Math 1. Okay, we know that as soon as the enrollments are done, right? And so beginning of grade 3 ELA, well, that BOG test, sharing that information in December, that BOG was done in August, right? And so, or September. So what I was trying to get to is understand, is there some data points there that would be appropriate to bring forward here, like those formative or quarterly assessments that are built into the curriculum, at least in some of our curriculum?
Yeah, and so the easiest question is it depends. So there's a variety of factors. The thing that I most encourage your administration to focus in, what I described a moment ago, is what's the degree of correlation. And generally, whether or not there is one depends on a handful of factors. So for example, formative data almost never reveals that, only because it's not designed to. There are questions of, is it vertical scale? There's just questions of, is it aligned to the state standards? Is it, so whether it's formative versus interim versus summative matters, whether it is norm referenced or criterion reference matters. Like, there's a variety of different characteristics of an assessment instrument, and those different characteristics all play a significant role in whether or not, in the extent to which this will be predictive. So, for example, often your unit assessments aren't intended to be predictive of the summative. They aren't aligned in that way. They're designed very differently. But you may have other unit assessments that are. And so if they are, if there is a moderate to strong correlation, then whatever the stars alignment of psychometric properties are involved in the assessment that allow for that to be the case, then great, use it. But just understand that there are going to be some assessments that you deploy that it makes a lot of sense kind of rationally that this is what your interim goal should be based on. But if the math don't work out, then the math just doesn't work, and you should not use it only because it's not sufficiently predictive. Because remember, that's the point of this exercise, is help us have some insight into the future that would inspire changes in behavior right now, whether by the board or by the administration. And so that's the key thing, is your administration actually has to do the homework to figure out what's the kind of predictive capacity of this particular assessment, the results from this particular assessment. And just because of the different properties of assessments, sometimes that reveals kind of stranger results than you would have expected. Oh, well, this seems like a really, really great assessment. Teachers love it. So why aren't we using this? And usually the answer boils down to, because of its the assessment properties of it, it makes it perfect for that use, but imperfect for this use.
Thank you.
Shall we move?
Other questions? And by the way, this is exactly the sophistication of inquiry that is going to set you all up for tremendous success in your monitoring. Because normally, these are not the questions I'm fielding at this point in the conversation. Normally, we're still kind of getting basic blocking and tackling, but these are some really sophisticated questions around the validity of data and the reliability of what the board is receiving. And so I absolutely love this conversation. My inner data nerd is all at Twitter, so thank you for that. Other questions for clarification before we transition? Then with a little bit of time remaining, I want to wind this down in about 10 minutes and then talk through some next steps before we adjourn. And so even though we did not spend this conversation on the things that we intended to, this is actually a really spot-on perfect conversation, because my sense is it sounds like you all are much more clear on what the work of monitoring is and what the work of monitoring is not. And that is a clarity that will serve your children well and serve you as a governing body and a fiduciary quite well. And so with a little bit of time remaining before we get to next steps, I just want to go around the table and invite people to ask a question that has occurred to you for this particular monitoring report. And then I'll be able to give you instant feedback on how you might want to recalibrate it. And it may be the case that you all have already done that recalibration and there won't be a lot to do. So let's just go around, give each of you an opportunity to ask one question on your list of questions relative to this monitoring report. We'll see if there's any need for calibration, and then we'll move on. Feel free to pre-calibrate so there's no work for me to do. And then we'll wind this thing down and get out of here. My screen's too tiny. Are there 9 people in the room? Are there all 9 board members present?
No, 2 have stepped out.
Okay, so we've got 7. All right, well then,
7.
we've got 7 folks. Who's got the first question?
I'm going to go to Ms. Sawyer because she had asked a question. Are you ready? Yes?
Sure.
No?
I
You
thought
had
I already
asked a question
did
and
2
then
of
you had
these.
said, well, can I get the answer now?
Oh, well, I don't think I get the answer. I think this is just practice asking the questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've mismanaged the time, so we're not gonna have time for, answers, just for questions and calibration.
Okay. So referring to Table 2, the CMS 2021 actual scores exceeded state scores in all subgroups except those of Hispanic students. To what do you attribute both our exceeding state performance for some groups and the lagging of the state for Hispanic subgroups?
Rock star, there's nothing to do here. Keep asking those questions. Next.
I don't really have a question. I've asked most of mine already. Thank you.
All right.
So I'm next. And I had that question about staffing. Oh, wait, Ms. Fowler.
No, it's okay. I don't know the difference between formative and summative data, so I think I need to do my own research.
No, that's good. You may have something.
Okay, so no, let's use that. So that, to me, is a technical question. We're asking what's the difference between this thing and that thing? And so if you were struggling with that and asked in a board meeting, then your board chair would be like, that sounds like a technical question. Superintendent sent us something home. And so the better thing to do is when stuff like that comes up, and if there's any unclarity, then submit those questions in advance. That is a perfect example of a technical question to get clarity about. Is there somebody on administration who wants to answer this, or I can answer it? I know, Superintendent, or you or somebody on your team want to answer this. This is actually a question I'd like to answer right quick before you move on. Is it something you or somebody on your team wants to, or you want me to?
I'm happy, Mr. Crable, to take a stab at that.
Take it away.
So when I think about summative assessments, I think of assessments that occur at the end versus throughout or toward the beginning. Formative assessments typically take place throughout, at the beginning. When I think of summative, I think about assessments that occur at the end of a particular course.
Is that helpful? Or do you need more detail? How did that work for you?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll go next, but this may be too broad.
And one thing, I will send you, Madam Chair, I will send you a document this evening that you can share with board members that will have a lot of those type of definitions in it that talk about the difference between formative, summative, interim, norm reference, criterion reference, just a lot of this kind of assessment jargon speak that's valuable. I'll share a document with you if you can share it with your colleagues or whomever. That way, people will have a place to refer to when you hear jargon about assessment. Hopefully, this will give you a spot to go to check in and see if there's an answer there. And then if not, certainly submit to your superintendent in advance so you can get that answer back to you. I'm sorry, Elise, go for it.
So here's my question, and it's really broad. But looking at Table 1, Math 5, Table 2, Math 8, Table 3, Math 1 in high school, we have fallen into a crater. And yes, that's because of the pandemic. That is a significant factor, but what in the world are we going to do about it? Is that too broad?
Okay, so a couple things. One, I would encourage board members to be slightly more clinical in these conversations. And so what happened is you offered a characterization of the data. What you really want to know is, does your superintendent share your characterization of the data? Or what you really want to know is, what is the superintendent's characterization of the data? So instead of saying, hey, we fall into a crater, maybe the superintendent doesn't think that. And so rather than offering a characterization or opinion about the data, one thing I would start with is asking maybe something equally broad, but to try to get at that, is how would you characterize, looking at this data overall, big picture, how would you characterize it? That might be a question to start to get a sense of, is he seeing a deficiency that you're not? Is he seeing an asset that you're not? The second part of it that I would note in the question is that question is purely looking forward. You all want to avoid the temptation of trying to jump to answers. You first want to be deeply entrenched in the data such that you understand how we got here. And so if I can ask you basic questions about how we got here and you can't answer them, then you all haven't asked enough questions yet. If I've got questions about who we're talking about, what happened and why it happened, that I can ask you as a board member and you don't know the answers to them, then you're not ready to ask questions about what are we going to do next because you don't sufficiently understand how we got to where we are. Said differently, in carpentry, it's the idea of measure twice, cut once. It's often, I think, misattributed to Einstein, the idea, quote, if I had 20 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 15 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes enacting a solution. That's the same concept here. In monitoring, you generally want to spend 2/3 to 3/4 of your time looking backwards and really gleaning knowledge and understanding from the data. And then once you have that, spend the final third or quarter of your time really then digging into questions about, okay, so now what are we going to do? Now that we have a really clear understanding of how we got here, what the circumstances are, now what are we going to do? And from that position, you'll be better able to gauge to what extent does my chief executive have a meaningful grasp on the severity of the circumstances and is proposing solutions that are at a level of severity that matches the severity described in the data. But until you've had that type of in-depth conversation, again, normally the first 2/3 to 3/4 of the conversation, any answers that you get are sufficiently decontextualized that they're not going to be helpful for you making strategic decisions based on them in the future. And so all that to be said, the question that you fundamentally got to is a question about what are you going to do about all of this? And my encouragement is don't start with that question. Make that the question at the end of the conversations, not at the beginning of the conversation.
So,
Lisa, does that make sense?
Can I do it? Can I adjust the question then and see if
Yeah, go for it.
See if I hit it? Because I'm going from too tactical to too broad. I'm going to find it in the middle there. So looking at table 3, I am the final column. There's some low test scores, really low test scores. I mean, really low percentages of levels 4 and 5 for Math 1 in high school, particularly so for Black and Hispanic students, but for all students. Why do you think that is? Is that too broad, or is that work?
So yes, and that's a perfectly reasonable place to start a conversation. And what will generally happen from that is the superintendent will offer a equally kind of broad response to that, but that creates an opening to kind of start peeling the onion and really go, okay, so I hear you saying that we're experiencing this in these two particular student groups, because they had lower attendance than everyone else. As you all analyze this, why did you find that to be the case? Or what factors did you find that were exacerbating that that wasn't impacting other communities. Like at that point, you could start peeling the onion to get really in-depth clarity about what is the best use of our limited financial resources in the school system to attack this. I watched a board, they jumped into a conversation about how are you going to fix this? And the superintendent gave them an answer. Because they asked a question, and the problem with asking a question to the board members, the superintendent's going to answer you, as sad as that might be. And so they asked right at the start of monitoring, hey, we see this, we're angry about it, what are you going to do about it? And the superintendent gave them an answer, we're going to do this. And then, by the grace of God, they dove into asking really questions and peeling back and getting at some of the underlying conditions. And then by the end of the conversations, one of the board members was like, well, wait a minute, why are we going to do that if these factors suggest we do something else? The superintendent's like, oh yeah, you know what, you're right. We actually need to be going in this direction. That makes more sense. Who screwed up more, the board or the superintendent? Non-rhetorical.
Like the board. Sound like the board. I don't.
Yeah, so in this moment, by leading with a what are you going to do next question, they put the superintendent on the spot, and the superintendents, when put on the spot, are going to do what they've been trying to do. They're going to try to produce an answer. And the horrible thing that might happen to you is if they had never come back around and circled all the way back around and got back to the point of realizing, wait a minute, that first answer isn't as kind of spot on what our students need, then the superintendent would have gone and executed on the thing that he told his board he was going to do. But that failure of discernment, while I don't excuse the superintendent, began with a failure of leadership on the part of the board and failed monitoring practice. Like what you do here is going to have an impact, in monitoring conversations, is going to have an impact on the culture of your organization. Do we think first and then act, or do we shoot from the hip because it looks good on TV? Like, it is really important that you get this part right.
Okay. So Sean, we're each asking, we're just giving example questions to AJ to calibrate, like, yeah, that's the right kind of, that's strategic versus.
Let's take time for one more question and then let's wrap this thing up.
So you're good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Margaret?
Anybody else? We'll do one more if anybody has it, otherwise we'll wrap this thing up.
I got one. And I'm trying to figure out, as we're talking, it goes backwards and then it's got a forward focus. So I'm going to try to get this out, see how, and you can dissect it or whatever. Superintendent, the state overall math scores have dropped precipitously. What has the state, I'm trying to figure this out, have you heard of any new initiatives or investments that the state is looking at in terms of math support?
Got it. All right. So two things. One, you did the same thing that Elise did, is you started off by offering an opinion rather than inquiring as to the superintendent's assessment of it. And so I'd say, and so a different question. And the other thing that you missed is you didn't point to exactly which data set you were talking about.
Okay.
And so maybe what I would do for that is, this is a two-part question. The first question would be, Superintendent, I'm looking at table 3, all students, and I'm noticing that, with 87% of our students, testing, not a whole lot of them are at level 4 and 5. What is your, assessment of how, of what that data means? Is this something we should, be worried about, or is this something that, is this normal? Like, what's your assessment of what this means? And give the superintendent an opportunity to identify, yes, this is, 1 alarm fire. No, this is a 5 alarm fire. Like, in that moment, you free up the superintendent to clarify for you what he believes is be the severity. Because the last thing that you want, think of monitoring as opportunity for calibration. The last thing you want as the board is to think that something is 5 alarm serious and never find out that your superintendent only thinks it's one alarm series because you never asked the question.
Got it.
Like, it'd be really useful to you to know. He's like, oh yeah, this is no big deal. Kids can't read. That's all right. It's North Carolina. Yeah, whatever. That's what we do.
Well, and part of me is like, I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, I just think the state we have just failed across the state in this, and I don't think we're getting support. So I'm trying to figure out,
Oh, so let's come to the second question. Yeah.
Is the bar too high? I mean, not high, are we looking at the right
No,
bar?
no, no.
I've got all these questions about that.
No, the bars, I don't know what, I want to start by being clear.
Right.
I don't know what the bar is, but what I assure you is, my belief is it's almost certainly not too high.
Got it.
Like I never look, my first instinct is never to think that we are expecting too much of children. It's that my first instinct is always, we've got to change my behavior as an adult first, and start to cause adult behavior change in our system. And so that's where I would always lead you. And even if the facts prove that the bar is too high, I'd still probably say the bar is not too high, and that our actions have to be grounded in what can we change that is within our locus of control.
And what I'm thinking is, if I am thinking about that correctly and behind the data behind it, then I can look at growth, then I can look at upward projection, and then we eventually get to the place where if the bar is too high, that's going to probably pan out because we have done the things we needed to do to meet over time, and this bar is abnormally wacky. So
yeah, and if you all get to the point where you come to that conclusion, so be it. I'm not saying that's a bad conclusion. I'm saying my default is to always look within my locus of control before I look externally.
Gotcha.
And so before I would look at that, I would always look internally, like, are we doing the things that we can best do to set students up for success? And then once I've answered that question, then I start looking around like, are there externalities that I need to go be an advocate in that are setting my students up to fail? But I never encourage public officials to start with externalities, always start with locus of control.
Okay.
So the second question you asked, the major adjustment I'd make is it was a forward-looking question, not a backward-looking question. So you asked, what do you see the state doing that's going to help us, essentially? I would modify the polarity of that early in the conversation. So the first question was superintendent, kind of what level of severity do you assign to this? The superintendent said, this is 5-alarm, severity. And so then the follow-up question is, to what extent, has, the state, been an ally in this, and what does that look like? And then give the superintendent opportunity to describe, to what extent, going backwards, has, the state been an ally in this work and providing resources and so on and so forth. And I would do all of that long before I get to the question you actually asked, which is, instead of asking, okay, so going forward, what help are we getting from the state? I'd say, superintendent, going forward, what are the best sources of support to help us accelerate from where we are, rather than assuming the state is the best source. Because in some places, maybe the state has awesome resources, and in some places, speaking as a former state employee, I've seen circumstances where, as a state, we had great supports, and I've seen circumstances as a state where what we had was not going to help folks, and that we needed to recalibrate ourselves at the state. And so I would not go in with the assumption that the state has answers for you. I'd ask, what are the sources of support that you're pursuing, and is there anything you need from us to effectively pursue those? That's kind of some of the culminating questions I'd eventually get to. Does that make sense to you in terms of your questions?
Yeah.
Can Jennifer ask Jennifer asked me if she could get one quick question.
Just really quick, I'm looking at the needed next steps. I'm trying to look beyond the actual data charts. So I just want to clarify, would it be appropriate here to ask a question about the needed next steps?
If it's in the monitoring report, it's fair game. Just do exactly what you did and make sure you point to exactly where in the monitoring report that you're pulling from.
Okay, that's it. I won't ask it. I'm just
and
wanted
as
to.
for the chair, like I've got the form, like you were saying 2/3 or 3/4 of the time should be backwards looking, but then towards the end of the conversation, you shift to the forwards looking questions. So that's when the next steps.
Yeah, and so as chairs, sometimes what happens, you say, hey, hold on, Jennifer, that's a great question, but hold that. Let's finish doing some retrospective. And then when we come to looking prospectively, I want to call on you first to get that question back in. That's, as a board chair, that's generally how I try to handle that.
Okay, thank you.
So next time, we're going to use what we learned here and put it into practice.
It's hard for me to describe for you just how exciting this work is, because inside of this, we get to create a culture where learning is the norm, where having rigorous and brutal conversations about the data isn't perceived as personal, it's perceived as passionate, and that it's a reflection of our commitment to what's possible for children. It's not an opportunity to beat up on the adults. We're always really soft and gentle on the adults, really hard, on the data. And so when monitoring is done well, it sends a clear message throughout the culture that as adults, we always check the data to figure out what are the adjustments that we need to make on behalf of the students we serve. And that's just as true in the boardroom as it is in the classroom. Like, your teachers and principals should be inspired to go and reinvigorate their PLC work as a result of watching the board effectively engage in a governance level PLC every single month. Like, that's the cultural opportunity that exists inside of this conversation. And just the way that you all are showing up in it so early on, when we haven't even done a ton of practicing, is really exciting. I definitely look forward to, as you all get into the actual work, capturing that video and being able to show it to other boards and say, hey, these folks in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, they got something going. If you want to see what it looks like to monitor student performance in a way that's really going to drive performance improvements for students, check what these folks at CMS got going. I'm just completely excited. Our next steps, like I said, we're still hopefully on track that by February it is, not January. I've been saying January, I'm wrong. That ideally by February we'll be able to begin monitoring. Part of the reason it can't be January is because you've got some data coming in that's simply not going to be available yet in January. I was going over this with your administration and recognized that I had messed up and misunderstood such that I've been saying January, like I've been saying all evening, when I should have been saying February. And so the intention here is that in February, we'll be able to kick off some of the monitoring. Your administration is going to offer you a monitoring calendar that lasts the fullness. I think it's a full 36 months left in this cycle. Know that the first year of a new monitoring calendar is always a little bit wonky as you're bringing things online, but then the out years are pretty normalized. And it's pretty much in February this happens, in March this happens, in June this happens, in August this happens, so on and so forth. And so we're bringing that online. What that means is we've got, it sounds like a lot of time, but especially given holidays, there's very little time left that we'll be using to continue to hone the ability of the board and the superintendent to engage in these monitoring conversations. I'm looking forward to working with your team to hopefully schedule at least another one, maybe two of these sessions so that we can just get deeper into it, give you more practice, so that when we do dive into actual monitoring in February, that you all are positioned for success and to really honor the needs of your students in those conversations. As always is the case, if there's anything you need from me, let me know. I'll be sending one document to the administration with the enhanced advising relative to interim goals. I'll be sending one document to the board in regard to just different elements of assessment to be mindful of as you go into this. But as always, if there's anything else that you all need, any other way I can be setting you up for success, just know that you have a tireless advocate, and I'm happy to be of service. Madam Chair, back to you.
And next up, also, we're going to finish up our goals and guardrails. Next time we see you, we're going to be working on that. That tied up with a bow. All right, is there any further business? If there's no further business, then this meeting is adjourned. Thanks. See you later. You can't see us, but I'm waving.